Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Joan Esposito Show. My name is William Muck, and I'm going to be filling in for Joan for a couple days this week. I'll be here today, and I'll be back on Friday, and I couldn't be more thrilled to be here with you. As many of you know, I'm a political science professor at North Central College out in Naperville, and the really good news is that I'm being joined by my colleague, Dr. Suzanne Chod, who is also a professor of political science at North Central. So you get a double dose of political science today. Welcome, Suzanne. I'm so excited to have you join me on the show.
Thanks for having me. I can't wait to get into it.
We're going to have a lot of fun, and we're going to have lots of good conversations about everything you can think about in terms of politics. Before we dive in, I'm just going to give you a quick overview or preview of our plan for the show today. For the first half an hour or so, Suzanne and I are going to talk through some of the latest political developments, including Trump's cabinet. We'll also probably talk about this conversation about tariffs. At 2:30, we're going to open the phone lines and take some calls, phones, and text lines for a full hour. So, full hour of conversation with you all then. At 3:30, we're going to be joined by Barbara McQuade, who's a former federal prosecutor, currently a professor at the University of Michigan. And many of you will know her as a legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. She's just fantastic. She's going to talk with us about her new book on political disinformation, but we're also going to pick her brain about Jack Smith and the Attorney General. So we'll kind of think more broadly about all of that. And then you really want to set your alarm, because for the last 30 minutes of the show, Suzanne and I will be sharing our top political turkeys of the year. And we will make sure to open the text line so you can also share your favorite political turkeys of the year as well. That's really good stuff. So get your thinking caps on. Who do you think has been the biggest political turkey? And obviously Donald Trump is one, but I think we can do better, right? Let's think about some other ones. And so we're going to have a lot of really, really important topics, and it's going to be fun. So, all right, Suzanne, we were quickly reminded today of the fire hose of news that is Donald Trump, nonstop chaos and controversy. Just yesterday and today, he was on social media pledging an executive order for a 25% tariff on all goods coming from Canada and Mexico, another 10% on goods coming from China. These are our three biggest trading partners. Day one, should we be surprised that this is the new pace of news and chaos?
Well, first, I think we need to ask North Central for a raise, because if all of these tariffs are coming on, then we're not going to be able to afford our household goods anymore, which we can get into, of course. Yeah. But I think the general point that you're making is we do tend to forget how chaotic things were in his first transition, and really the first year of his presidency, when no one really knew what they were doing. Yeah. But because he promised this, and this was really his only economic message, he has no choice but to say, this is what I'm doing on day one. And he's talked about mass deportations on day one, all of these things that he's promised, right? There was a little bit of a lull where we were wondering, who was the Commerce Secretary going to be? Was that going to be someone that they were going to, that the two of them were going to work on something together, perhaps? Were they going to go to members of Congress? This is not Trump's style, of course, right? Yeah. He's going to come out and say, this is what we're doing. He wants to run the news cycle right now as we run into the holidays. People coming around Thanksgiving talking about turkey and the price of household goods. He wants people sitting at the table saying, this time next year, because of all of these tariffs, because of President Trump, this stuff is going to be cheaper.
The irony of all of this, though, is like the tariffs are more likely than not going to drive expenses. I mean, we're not economists, but we talk to economists, and like we sort of know basic Econ 101. Yes. If you start putting tariffs 25, 30%, the cost of goods are going to skyrocket. So somebody who ran on a pledge of fixing the economy and putting the economy in a better position is suddenly, if he implements these, we're going to see prices go up. Yes. I mean, I don't understand the sort of disconnect between the people, and these ideas. It's really extraordinary.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is, not only is the price of goods going to go up, but the reports suggest that inflation is going to go up by about 1%. Yeah. So by this time next year, if all this goes into place, we're going to go from 2.5% to 3.5% inflation. And we're going to have an increase in the cost of goods. So it's not just the tariffs itself that are going to, we're going to pay more money because of this fee on these goods. It's also going to cause inflation to go up. And so to your point about this disconnect, right, is that my students were probably telling you this, and the same to me, is the two biggest questions that people were Googling the day after the election are, what are tariffs and can I change my vote? Yeah. And I'm not suggesting that the can I change my vote. We could talk about civic engagement and civic education on that one.
The answer to that one is no.
That's a hard no. Come take our classes. We'll tell you why. But the fact that people don't know what tariffs are, because it's such a shortcut for their cue giver, their leader, to say, I don't know what this word means, but I will tell you what this thing will do.
Yeah.
I will do this, and you will make money.
Sure.
And we'll start making things in the United States again.
Well, I think that's part of it, right? There's this fear of internationalism. There's this turning away from globalization and the free market. And I understand that, right? You see that critique coming from both the left and the right to say capitalism isn't always fair. It doesn't distribute goods equally. There's that frustration.
Yeah.
But if you start putting 25% tariffs on all goods coming from Canada and Mexico, right, the very immediate effect, as you said, is going to be inflationary pressures, and that's going to hit people at home.
Yeah.
And it's going to be much more difficult for Trump to spin that to say, oh, this is Biden or this is something other, because he is the one who's implementing these policies.
Yes, but he's going to blame someone, right?
Sure,
I mean, because here's the thing, this is, and economists have told us this, and sometimes critique political scientists when we tell people that policymakers have some kind of power, because typically economic cycles are going to do what they're going to do regardless of fiscal and monetary policy, regardless of who the president is, whatever. And I think there's probably some truth. The middle probably is where the truth lies. But when Trump came in the first time, he inherited Obama's great economy and then took credit for all of the things that were going well until COVID and then blamed COVID. Yeah. Markedly, we know that the things that the Biden administration has done and that the members of Congress, when they actually passed stuff, has driven down inflation, tried to drive down the cost of goods. Wages have increased. The economy, by all metrics, is actually quite strong. So he's going to ride that. Yeah. But he is quickly, to your point, going to sink all of it if he does the things he says he's going to do.
Right. Absolutely. Right. And when you look at the U.S. economy in a comparative perspective, especially when you compare it to some of the advanced developed democracies, the United States has recovered from COVID economically far better than most European countries. So, Trump is walking into a really good economic situation and is going to make a choice that is there's few things that you can do to screw the economy up quickly, but 25% tariffs is one of them. It's going to be devastating.
Yes, it is. And I had used a statistic earlier when we did a panel on campus last week. But so since COVID, so during the Biden administration, the cost of everyday goods went up about 20%, and went up, and now it's going back down, but it went about 20%. But most people, so a vast majority of people, the perception is that goods increase 2 or 3 times the price of goods. And so, of course, when Trump is going out there with bacon and all these eggs, and he's like showing a bacon, what do you say, like it's like 800% or whatever.
Bacon's expensive.
Bacon's so expensive. Yeah. It is, but okay, but still, it's not 2 or 3 times more expensive. Sure. But there's this perception that everything is actually more expensive than it is. And I think, to be fair, of course, some of us sit in positions where we can afford when milk goes up and when eggs go up and all of that. And that's not the reality for everyday Americans, right? For every person. But when we're told that things are actually more expensive than they are, and we're told we can afford less than we probably can as a way to win an election, and then you're going to tank the economy when it's actually doing better than people think, it just feels like it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. There's a real disconnect there. And then the other thing as we started with this fire hose of news, like Biden was calm and quiet. I mean, he really believed in, I'm going to stay behind the scenes. I'm just going to go and do good governance. And, whether it's international or domestic politics, he just wanted to solve problems. And there wasn't a lot of flashiness to it. He wasn't out there talking about the stock market every day or creating drama or chaos. And Trump's not even back yet. And I can feel my anxiety going up because every day there's some new story breaking, some drama, whether it's internal dynamics or these sort of policies. And he's already, Trump is already squabbling with, Canada and Mexico. So the Mexican president was tweeting, back at Trump today. Like, this is not, I'm not quite ready for this yet.
No, I'm not. No. And also this is, we talk about this with our students all the time, is that they've only been socialized in their first president they ever remember, they were socialized in the first Trump White House. And so their expectations is that presidents are loud and bombastic and they're tweeting and they're always talking and they're always taking credit and they're always making news. That's actually not typically what presidents do. And in fact, we don't really want them to do that. And so Biden's style of governance, and you would know better than I as an international relations scholar, is actually what we need for stability, for calm, both internationally and domestically. Because to your point, he just puts his nose down and he solves problems. Yeah. He doesn't take credit. He just does the work. And even if we don't see it, and sometimes he gets criticized for it, he's doing the good work. But now, while he's trying to keep his nose down and do whatever work he can in the months he has left, Trump is hitting us in the face with all of these things, and now we're sort of back to where we started with this president that just never stops.
It speaks to what we as voters want now, or some voters, right? I think there's many of us that like the idea of good governance, solving problems, but there's a lot of us who also love to be entertained.
Oh, yes.
And Trump entertains, right? And I think we're seeing that already where, I mean, the cable news networks have to love this because it's, you know, even though it's chaos, it's entertaining chaos. And, but it's really difficult to solve problems when you're doing this because it's not a meaningful conversation about how do we think about the economy? How do we really address these long-term systematic problems that people are feeling? And, you know, Trump doesn't want to do that. He wants to, you know, create entertainment and drama and then, you know, and then just sit back and enjoy that.
Well, and I think some of this is we expect that action and loudness equals success, right? And just in American culture, right? I think we expect this. And so when he is out there and he's talking all the time and he seems like he's being active and energetic, we presume he is solving problems because action and voice equals success. But really, it's all flash and no substance. And then you look at Biden, who is all substance and no flash, and maybe some would argue not enough flash.
Right.
We assume he's doing nothing. People are like, only people in my family, in fact, were like, is he even still president? Like, is he even still around? It's like, actually, it's a good thing if you don't know what he's doing, because that means he's actually working.
We don't want a reality TV president, but that's where we're at. So, all right, well, we should probably move to a quick break, and then I see the phone lines are already filling up, so maybe we come back, we can start taking some calls and then continue our conversation. We haven't even gotten to his cabinet yet. All right, we will be back in just a few minutes.
Dive deeper into the heart of the news and stories at WCPT 820 and across the Midwest by checking out our website, heartlandsignal.com.
It's the coverage I can count on every time.
For the latest news updates, in-depth analysis, compelling stories, comprehensive election coverage, live streams, and thought-provoking opinions, head to heartlandsignal.com.
When I need to know, they're there.
They keep me informed and updated wherever I am.
Stay informed with WCPT 820, your go-to source for where facts matter.
Alexa, play WCPT.
WCPT from TuneIn.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. As I am Willie Muck, and I'm being joined today by Dr. Suzanne Chod from the Department of Political Science at North Central College, and we've been talking a little bit about Trump, and we see that Steve from Oak Lawn is on the line and wants to talk about Trump's comments. So why don't we go to Steve?
Okay, I got two little things to say about Trump. First of all, the election of Trump proves that there is no God, or if there is a God, he's really not a very nice guy.
He's not a woman, I'll tell you right now.
You know, one thing, Steve, I will say to this, I have often thought if the democracy gods may be testing us, right? That they may be saying, let's come down with the worst possible candidate that a democracy's ever seen and see whether the voters can fall prey to them. And I think we've proven that we will, right? That voters will vote for a candidate with as many flaws as possible. So, I think the democracy gods are a little concerned right now. Steve, what was your other comment?
Okay, just that, all right, I got it. I'm thankful for Donald Trump. He has given me a reason to live. I just want to make sure I outlive that rat, you know what.
You want to live long enough to see him out of office in 4 years.
I want to live long enough so that he dies before I do.
That's great.
Well, depending on how much McDonald's he eats, we'll see how actually that works. You know, we're not wishing that on anyone, but hopefully he takes better care of himself.
Well, I think we should say, like, people are having a real reaction to this, right? There are people, I mean, we were talking, and it was after the election. It took you a couple days before you could go back and look at the news again. And I know, actually, I was just talking to my mother-in-law today, and she's sort of pulling away from the political news. And I've got friends who are very, very engaged in politics and now feel like they have to step away because it's hard to understand how a political system can make the choices that we've made. And for many individuals, it's this sort of trauma kind of working through all of this.
It absolutely is. And for some of us, we dip in harder because we want to push against these things more. And for others, that their whole existence is doing that and they're exhausted.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Well, here's my thing about Thanksgiving. Who in their right mind goes to a Thanksgiving dinner just waiting to argue about politics with anybody. That's ridiculous. You go there to have good food and talk to your family and watch football.
This is
Forget the politics and religion and stuff.
I agree with you, Steve, but I think you may be in the minority. I think a lot of people actually like to go talk politics with their family at Thanksgiving or fight politics.
Fight
yes,
on purpose.
They're masochists. All these people are masochists. That's what it is.
I just want to stuff my face with food. I don't want to yell at anyone else.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And no, I think this is.
Let's have a good meal.
Yeah, absolutely. And enjoy the peace. Well, thank you so much, Steve. This is a real thing, right? Thinking through how as somebody who's studied many presidential elections, who's lived through presidential elections, right? There is a sort of a hangover period, depending on whether one wins or loses, there's sort of a really psychological dynamic to it all.
There is. And there was a study done in 2016 that looked at the length of time families spent together on Thanksgiving, and they could track, unfortunately, with cell phones. And in houses where there was disagreement over which candidate should have won, they spent less time together.
That's interesting.
So we'll see if they do the same study this time.
I totally see that could be happening. So,
yes.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate it. We should move on. Jim from Chicago. Hi, Jim. How are you?
Hi. Good afternoon. Bobby Kennedy Jr. was disqualified out of the Democratic Party as far as being a medical genius, but apparently Trump's embraced him. And I heard this morning that in Samoa, he advised the president of Samoa to give up on measles vaccines, and 90 children died as a result. So we're in good hands with Bobby Kennedy Jr. I don't know if he has what his credentials are, but apparently Trump's enthusiastic about it. So we should be in good hands. Our health should be in good hands. And I heard a Georgetown professor say, with his picks, he's giving the middle finger to science and medicine. Mm-hmm. He's giving the middle finger to both of them. Mm-hmm. And why that is, God only knows. I mean, why would an old man, hitting 80 years old, want to jeopardize the health of Americans is anybody's guess. And you guys have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. Yeah, the RFK pick really is extraordinary. And it's one of those picks where there are things about RFK that when you listen to him talk, you say, hey, this guy's interesting. When he talks about, food and mass processed food, you say, hey, this guy seems like he's onto something. Mm-hmm. And then you hear him talk about vaccines and fluoride in the water. And again, there's this major disconnect between him mm-hmm. and science. Mm-hmm. What's your sense of the legs of this candidacy? Do you think, as we think about this moving through the Senate, is this one that Republican senators will say this goes too far? Is this a Matt Gaetz, or is this something where he's likely to sneak through?
So I've been thinking about this a lot because on face value, especially for what Jim said, is like, what are his credentials? But what are the credentials of most of these cabinet picks? That hasn't seemed to bother a lot of Senate Republicans, for example. But I think the thing about RFK that is the least surprising of all of the picks is we've seen such a polarization over science over the past 8 years, let's say. And so there's some really interesting data that show that after Trump's presidency, as we've seen conspiracy theories get more legs, just generally speaking, not just the big lie, that the skepticism in science increased exponentially, and the gap between Democrats and Republicans trusting science as a thing is almost just as wide as the general partisan gap. So when RFK Jr. talks about being questioning about whether we should have vaccines and talks about taking fluoride out of water. Those are all things that are being talked about in pockets of the electorate that has a lot of support. And when Trump leads with he's going to make our kids healthy again. Yeah. To your point, how do you sort of say no to that? Sure. And so if they can push more of he's going to get our kids healthy again, and we're going to really test science and see what science really proves now, I think he gets through.
This is really something, because you think about we started talking about tariffs, that will have an immediate impact. But if RFK is able to play a role in decrediting vaccines, and not just COVID, I mean, he's talking about flu and the whole host of vaccines that have proven to save millions of lives, he is against. That will also be something that will have tangible, measurable impacts, not in a good way in the health of the country. Not at all. And I was talking to some friends of mine who have children who are in preschool, so they haven't started elementary school yet. And so if there are going to be state changes to what vaccines are required, we're talking about public health crises for children. Yeah. And so for us who have older kids, maybe this isn't as big of a consideration in our own family, but I have significant concerns about the health of children in future generations if they're not getting the polio vaccine,
or they're not getting the measles vaccine, and we're going to see children die for what appears to be no reason, because we should be skeptical, and I'm using air quotes, skeptical of scientists, because what is their motive? This
speaks to this broader anti-expert approach, the questioning of those who have training and expertise in things. I mean, this is all part of the Trump approach to government, is skepticism, and expertise is something to be laughed at and questioned, not something to be embraced. And it's one thing when it's political scientists like us, right?
We get this all the time.
This is a very, very common thing where, our dentist tells us he knows more about politics than we do, and we sort of get used to it. But it's more than that. It really is thinking about, doctors and across the board questioning expertise. And we forget how important all of this knowledge and expertise is for making a fully functioning democracy.
Well, and this is where populism can turn really, really dangerous, right? So populism doesn't have to be what it's become, but when you don't trust outsiders and you tell everyone not to trust outsiders, and when you are skeptical of any type of expert, and then and to replace the expert, say, I'm the only one you can trust, like classic demagogue behavior, that it also tests the bounds of these Senate Republicans thinking about running for re-election in 2 years, depending on who's up, or those that just came in, about, okay, well, if this is what my president wants, this is what my president gets.
The sense of skepticism. Yeah. And again, we're seeing this. I think that's a theme across many of these nominations, right? The same thing. Matt Gaetz was the classic example, and he didn't make it through, but somebody who, had no expertise in the law. I guess had a law degree, but had no real, experience controlling or managing. Exactly. Right. And in fact, the opposite, had all sorts of run-ins with the law. Right. But that sort of is relished in the Trump approach to it. And that can be really, really dangerous.
Well, and if we look at, and I know that this is something that we had to talk about potentially, is you look at the people who are going to be running the Department of Defense and National Intelligence and these agencies that are going to be, the decisions that are going to be made are going to fundamentally change the world if we're not being too overly dramatic.
100%.
And if they have no experience and if they have no direction because there's no adults in the room to help them, I have real fears about that.
Sure. Especially with individuals like that whose motivation is to sort of blow things up. I mean, the idea of RFK, and he's even openly said this, is to go in and make changes. And sometimes making changes can be a good thing. But he's talking about saying, like, we just need to start over, right? And that can be really, really dangerous as we're thinking about the implications for the health of our families and children and all of that. That scares me. And we can maybe come back and think about Department of Defense and the DNI and all of those things. Again, real tangible things where you want people who know what they're doing in those positions of power.
Well, and I think we often forget, because we spend so much time talking about cabinet, like the cabinet secretaries, which is not unimportant, is that we've got tens of thousands of civil servants who serve across presidencies, and they may or may not decide to stay or leave. Depending on the way you read the law, they may be fired, and that's actually going to be considered legal. And so any pushback that maybe some of those lower level officials may have, those who are actual experts in the field, if they're not there, not only are there no adults at the top, but there's no one at the bottom either. And so blowing it up from the inside, there's nothing to keep that from happening then.
That in some ways, and that's the goal, and then it makes it much easier to implement these sort of more radical changes. So, we are up against the break, and we come back. Maybe we can think about loyalty in some of these cabinet picks, right? So what happens when your entire system is based on appointing people who are loyal to you? And then we've got some more callers that we'll get to as well. So we'll be back in just a few minutes.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll. Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. My name is William Muck, and I'm so delighted to be here with also Dr. Suzanne Chod from North Central College. And we've just been talking a little bit about Donald Trump's cabinet appointees, and we were talking about RFK. And we've got Michael from Chicago who wants to talk about health care under the Trump administration. Hey, Michael, how are you?
Oh, pretty good. And I like to discuss the problem of vaccines, which you have discussed already. I think it's very serious. I think all smart scientific people should take their vaccination shots now. If they haven't got them for the winter, they should take their COVID-19, their flu shot, their RSV shot. They should take it now, because now the shots are free. They're free and easy to get. They're free with a medical card. You got to have a medical card, but most people do. But what's going to happen with Robert Kennedy Jr. and Trump, when they get hold of the government in January and February, they're going to reduce the vaccination program. They're going to cut it down, reduce it, make it hard to get, and they might even, in my opinion, have a copay. It won't be a free vaccination shot anymore, even with your medical card. They're going to want $20 or $25 a shot. They're going to say it's expensive, and the ordinary people have to share the burden. But I believe in free vaccination shots. So why we should not depend on Trump or Robert Kennedy Jr. to do anything good. The Trump lies a lot, and I think they're going to cut all the programs, all the social service programs, including the vaccination program. And then they're going to pass a law saying that nobody could be forced to have a vaccination shot. Now, in the last pandemic we had a couple of years ago, the state governments and the city governments, they did force a lot of their employees to get a shot. Either you got a shot or you were fired, you see. So a lot of people were forced to get a shot. They didn't want to do it, but they did it. But it helped them survive. But in the next COVID thing, in the next pandemic, they're going to pass a law, Robert Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, he doesn't believe in vaccinations at all. He thinks vaccinations cause autism, Robert Kennedy. He said this. Mm-hmm. So you're going to get no help from him at all. So I'm telling people right now, get your free shots now. You're free. You go down to Walgreens, CVS, you go down to Joe Osco, and you get your shot free. Why pay a $20 copay starting in February or March?
This is a great public service announcement, Michael, right? And I think it's really important that what you're saying here is that, vaccines aren't going to go away. They're still going to be out there, but there are a lot of things that an administration can do to make it more difficult to get those shots or maybe just not support those in the same way. And we think about funding for all sorts of medical opportunities. It is likely that under a Republican administration, we're going to see cutbacks on those things. What do you think, Suzanne?
Well, an additional point about all of this as we've been talking is thinking about who's going to be leading Medicare, Medicaid, and the Obamacare exchanges. And so if Dr. Oz, who has not been the biggest fan of any of these, is the one who's going to be working under RFK, overseeing Medicare, Medicaid, and the Obamacare exchanges and the Children's Health Insurance Program, and the way that there's the federal government programs, and then the states can also expand coverage, and a lot of these are managed by private health insurance companies. But if they're going to cut these programs, and they're going to cut access to vaccinations, and they're going to make our kids healthier by having food be healthier, but also then the cost of food is going to go up, but then we're not going to have the programs like the Children's Health Insurance Program or potentially TANF or other things for food stamps. There's a domino effect of all of these things. They're all connected.
Which may be more dramatic. Like normally in a Republican administration, you see a shrinking of the social safety net and you see an expansion under a Democratic administration. But it could be much more radical this time, right? Especially when you're talking about RFK and others who don't just want to tweak at the margins. They don't just want to cut the budget and make government a little bit smaller. They want to deconstruct many of these institutions that for decades have made a dramatic difference in people's lives.
Well, all of this, and then we see the fight with the federalism fight, which we saw during the pandemic, is that the Constitution says one thing about what the policing powers are of the federal government, but then the 10th Amendment says that things that are not given to the federal government are given to the states, and so there's fights over what level of government gets to make these decisions for its people. But if one of the things they're going to do is wipe everything out at the federal level and say, hey, states, you're on your own, we know that there's a problem when there's this sort of unevenness of all different kinds of programs at the state level.
Which is different from a more traditional Republican administration, right? I think that's why these conversations are so important. Michael, thank you so much. Any other thoughts on this?
Well, just that right now, everything you said, I agree with 100%. Right now in November, December, part of January, Trump takes over January 15th, I believe. We have the opportunity as individual citizens to take advantage of these last good free shots. If people have already gotten their shot, if they've gotten these shots, they're okay. But if you haven't, you can go to Walgreens or CVS and get these shots. And I hope in the future they won't charge a $20 copay, but it might happen because they want to cut the programs, these social service programs, and poor people don't have the money to pay $20 a copay for one shot. If there's a husband, wife, and 2 children, one shot, $25 copay, that's $100 for the whole family to get shots. That's a lot of money for a low-income person. That's a lot of money.
I really appreciate you sharing that message, Michael. It's absolutely important, and people should go out there and get the shots for all the reasons you articulated. It's really, really important. Thank you so much for the call, Michael. We got Steve on the Gold Coast who wants to talk about misinformation and disinformation. We're going to get to this a little bit later, but Steve, how are you doing?
Yes, I wanted to make a couple of points. And one, I think it's important to note that if you are covered in terms of private insurance, that exists in terms of the decision you've made in terms of agreement with the insurance company as of the end of December of this year. So you're pretty much covered through next year. So it's not as if the Trump administration can come in and tell Blue Cross Blue Shield, oh, by the way, the contract you entered into back in December or November, no, that doesn't apply. We're going to add some sort of copay. Now, where it can apply is that, there are the people who rely upon social services for their vaccines and so forth. But if you have private insurance, then that's more of a concern in 2026, not 2025.
That's an important point, yes.
That's point number one. Yeah. So, and secondly, I think you can't talk enough about what is essentially this epistemic crisis that we find ourselves in. Donald Trump does not get elected either in 2016 or in 2024, absent what is social media, the disinformation plague that exists out there. I mean, Tom Nichols wrote a great book, The Death of Expertise. He discusses this at length in numerous interviews and so forth. I mean, we have become a society in which everybody thinks that everyone and their mother is qualified to be an expert on everything. And, you can start your own YouTube page and decide, I'm going to be a public policy analyst, an economist, I'm going to do all of these things. And you can gain millions of followers. I mean, Alex Jones, he built an empire doing this sort of nonsense, advocating conspiracy theories. And the reality is that he had a larger audience than many of the most credible people in the industry. I mean, journalists, scholars, research. I mean, I can go down a long list. And that's the world in which we live. People have disconnected. They've cut the cable. They don't read newspapers. They certainly aren't interested in reading peer-reviewed journals.
No.
Few enough people do that to begin with, so I don't expect that they're going to. But, the idea was that at least through journalism and through other outlets, that some of the scholarship that's done at the university level, think tanks and so forth, would filter down through responsible journalism. But now you just have, like I say, fringe elements who pretty much dictate what's going on. And then there's what used to be an undercurrent of anti-intellectualism today has become a torrent, a hurricane.
Yes.
We have people, especially on the right, telling their children, I don't care if we have enough money. I don't care how well you did in high school. College is a terrible idea. It's nothing but a leftist academy in which they're indoctrinating you. I mean, can you think of anything more dangerous in terms of a 21st century economy than telling a bunch of people who could go to school don't get a degree?
Steve, you are preaching.
You're talking to professors.
Right. I mean, it's as if you've been on the college campus with us, because this is something we deal with on a day-to-day basis where we see this. And in fact, Suzanne and I, we've done quite a bit of writing thinking about the importance of civic education at all levels, right? Getting people to be aware of the political system they operate, to get educated, to be, meaningful and impactful citizens, because it's so important. Because when you don't have that type of civic education, it's so much easier to manipulate. And the Donald Trumps of the world thrive in an environment of sort of political ignorance.
Yes. And there's been so much research done on this recently, which is good. And even though they're skeptical of data and evidence and all the things that we, build our careers on, that there are certain types of people that are more susceptible to disinformation and conspiracy theories. And one of the hallmarks of people who are more likely to be susceptible are un- and undereducated people. And those who also spend a significant amount of time online.
Yes.
You put that together, and there's scholars who've argued we call them the know-nothings. They have this inflated sense of what they know, but not the cognitive reasoning to really sort of even when faced with counterfactual evidence, decide that they should change their positions. And without education, without a focus on fact-based information that we can actually agree are facts, as opposed to saying we have different kinds of facts, it's really hard to get out of this cycle.
It is. And Steve, go ahead, Steve.
At times I've had to refer people to but the Dunning-Kruger effect. I've asked them to look that up. This phenomenon in which the dumbest person in the room thinks that they are the smartest person in the room. Does that sound like anybody we all know? Yeah. And the reality is, and for the sake of full disclosure, I too am a doctor of political science.
Hey, all right.
I don't, but I mean the three of us can agree on something because we, unlike most people who don't understand what we do, I say it's akin to medicine. So if you study medicine, fine. Then you pick a specialty. And if you need an OBGYN, you don't go to the ears, nose, and throat guy.
I definitely don't.
Okay, and the same thing applies to our field. And, each of us have a subfield in which we specialize. And so when we talk about things, make sure when you're talking to some people, ask me questions about East Asia economics, about Central America, about what's going on in the Middle East. I tell them, it was not my focus. I'm sorry. Yeah, I can refer you to colleagues and so forth. Yeah. But do not get your information from one person. I don't care how qualified they are. I don't care what kind of credentials they have. Mm-hmm. You get your information from a broad base of credentialed people. And again, you've got to do this regularly because things change. It's very fluid in terms of what's going on out there. Yeah. But, I'm sorry, I just don't know how we dig our way out of this because we have a system right now, a paradigm in which people are being told, don't trust researchers, don't trust scholars, don't trust journalists. Basically, don't trust anybody who should know more than the average person. Well, that explains how we got President Donald Trump's second term.
Yeah,
absolutely right. And one of the criticisms of higher ed in the United States that always strikes me as just sort of unfounded or really silly is that people around the world want to come to American institutions. We get lots of students from all over the world, and to come to college or a college or university in the United States, they come here because they are the best, right? If you can go to school anywhere in the world, you still want to go to college in the United States. Right. Yet we see this massive critique within the United States criticizing the role of higher education. And I think that's so dangerous to undermine the process that really leads to enlightenment and education.
And that's the whole point of it.
And you have to remind people sometimes that with all due respect, no one's forcing your child to study sociology, psychology, gender studies, political science. If they want to be an engineer, they're not going to really encounter a whole lot of the things that we're talking about. Or if an accountant or a chemistry major, or I can go down along. Most of what you can get a degree in this country has nothing to do with those so-called fields where they claim we're indoctrinating their children.
Mm-hmm. They might get us political scientists for one class, right, Suzanne?
Just one.
Yeah. Exactly, because they have to fulfill a requirement. Exactly.
But that's where Bill and I talk about this often, is if we only get them once, then what is our responsibility to have them leave our classrooms as more enlightened, engaged citizens of the country and of the world? And we can only hope that, we can meet them where they are when we have them and they go out and do some good with it.
And we've pushed, right, in higher education to say, even if you're getting that engineering degree, even if you're getting that business degree, you benefit from a broadly liberal arts approach where, hey, you got to take a philosophy, you got to take a psychology, you take a political science, because that is going to serve you well as you go out in the world, because you're going to be able to problem solve. You're going to be able to see the complexity of the world that we operate in. And I mean, that's the value of a college education. And not a lot of people have that opportunity. Exactly. And we should celebrate that, not criticize it.
That's right.
Exactly, because we want to quantify everything in terms of, all right, how much is this degree going to make me over the course of a lifetime relative to earnings? And I say to people, perhaps you should consider a trade school, because the purpose of higher education is to enlighten you. Yeah. Reading Plato, I can't tell you it's going to be of any benefit to you in terms of bottom line over the course of a lifetime. That's not why we teach it.
No.
It's to hopefully make you understand, the underlying principles that define democracy and the thought experiments that he engaged in, and how that still is applicable today in the society in which we live and the government that we live under. But again, not everybody's interested in that. It's just bottom line.
Yeah. And in the absence of the world that you're describing, that's how somebody like Donald Trump, that's how we see these populists arise, because they can offer simple solutions to complex problems. And the public will eat that up, right? We tend to think that the public will see through these things. That's not true, right? Political parties are really the only check on populism. That's, something you learn in the political science literature, that the people will easily be swayed. And so that's why civic education is so important. And actually, education more broadly is really, really important. Steve, we're up against the break, but thank you so much. And I'm so glad to learn that you are a PhD in political science. We feel like we're a club here.
Exactly. Take care and have a good holiday.
All right. Thanks so much. All right. We'll be back in just a little bit.
Chicago's Progressive Talk, WCPT 820, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. I'm William Muck, and I'm joined today by Suzanne Chod. Real quick little announcement here. Tonight from 5 to 7 p.m., Patty Vasquez will be joined by guest host Dwayne Kennedy, and their guests will include stand-up comedian Tamale Sepp, WHBY Out of the Box host Ben Caminos, and Tennessee Brando, who is Midas Touch contributor, podcaster, and singer-songwriter. So that's Driving It Home with Patty Vasquez, having trouble talking, weeknights 5 to 7 on WCPT 820. So we have been kicking around all varieties of Donald Trumpism and education. Let's see. We should go to Ed, who's in Palos Park, who wants to talk about Trump's campaign and administration.
Yes, thanks for taking my call. Few points. One is the lack of aggression by Merrick Garland during his term. When you use the term that this is the top law enforcement officer in the country, well, he has not displayed any tenacity, any aggression, nothing. You don't even know who he is. You hardly hear his name. I know I'm sure they regret nominating him, and but he's going to be gone. So but the damage he's done by his failure to account for various situations that came up is just unforgiving. Also, lately I've been hearing Trump Jr. and Eric Trump going off on these tirades, repeating what Donald Trump has said, and I'm wondering, who are they? They don't hold political office, yet they get out there and they make these aggressive statements and go into this aggressive rhetoric, and I'm puzzled by that. But the way things are going, we don't get any pushback from the media questioning why are they allowed to do this. Well, it's free speech. I understand that. But, you would think there'd be some blowback saying who are they to be taking these strong political stances and not, being accounted for. So, and also the media with their softball attitude towards Trump. Right now you could fill up a 500-page book with all the lies, the blatant lies that, he has stated since he's been around the last 9-10 years. And I was hoping, or why don't they come out with a book, Trump Lies, in the last 10 years? That would be a whirlwind, People could actually read the lies. They have, they're documented, so on and so forth. And maybe these supporters of his would wake up.
Ed, I think you're a bit optimistic on that. I don't know if it's going to make a difference. I will say, the Washington Post has a fact checker that during the Trump administration, it was over 30,000. I can't remember.
And it was only 2 years in, I think.
Yes,
it was 30,000.
They were. So you can go. But what's really fascinating about this, Ed, is that presenting those who see Donald Trump as speaking the truth with the lies doesn't matter, right? It doesn't change. And that's one thing. The psychology of this is really powerful. It doesn't. The more Trump repeats a lie, the more likely people are to believe that, even if you are trying to discredit that. So even if you're fact-checking Donald Trump on things, but, the process of fact-checking, when you bring up that lie, it's more likely to settle in. So it's really difficult to confront this type of environment of dis and misinformation.
Yeah, and especially, I would just add, especially all the things that Bill said, but especially because what research has suggested is that when Donald Trump is fact-checked, it actually polarizes people further.
Yeah.
Because it reminds people who don't believe him how much he lies. And then it reminds people that do believe him that everyone's just out to get him. And actually, he's the only one speaking the truth. And so I've talked to students often about, what's the value of fact checking if it can actually polarize us further? And we all agree, the facts still matter. Right. Truth still matters. We should be writing this 500-page book, if not for real, but in our heads all the time.
Yes.
Because we have to confront this there are no alternative facts. There are no alternative truths. We have to confront this.
If we're going to be a functioning democracy, there has to be a baseline of facts that we can all debate and disagree over, right? We can have conversations about should the government be bigger, should the government be smaller, but you have to have a baseline of factual information to have those conversations. It's really, really important. The other interesting thing Ed brought up was this issue of the family and the role that Trump's family has played in his administration. Is this common, Suzanne? Do we normally see presidents who have their family members as part of an administration?
No, not at all. And so, but I've been thinking about this a little bit because on the campaign trail, it's not uncommon, obviously, for family members to be proxies, especially that's the job of the first spouse, right, is sort of be a proxy. And so on the campaign trail, it may not be that unusual, excuse me. But like when Ivanka and Jared worked in the administration, for example, there was question about whether or not that violated some kind of law, and that how much of a say will the sons have, the older sons have in an administration when they don't have any like paid official position. They're not spokespeople for the campaign anymore. They don't work for the White House, but they have a large mouthpiece and the ear of their father.
Yeah.
And so they have a lot of power. But where that actually rests, I'm not entirely sure.
And one of the things we see, so if you look at authoritarian regimes around the world and throughout history, one of the things you see is those authoritarians empower their family because they're the one thing they can trust, right? You can't trust somebody around you in your administration if you're not related to them. So I mean, there are deep authoritarian tendencies within Trump. And I think the reason he has his sons and, son-in-law and daughter, everybody around him is those are the figures he trusts. And then part of the reason we have such a cabinet that doesn't have much heft is because you don't want people with a spine, with backbone, with experience in those positions. Because it would mean you'd have to trust them. And we saw that in the first administration. Those with expertise, those who had some knowledge pushed back against him and made it more difficult for him to do the things he wanted to do, oftentimes anti-small d democratic actions.
And they either got fired or they left. Right? I mean, you can't, I guess you can kind of fire your kids and you can ask them to leave. Yeah. But I would say that also Eric and Don Jr. know that their bread and butter is with their father, right? Yeah. They make money because of him. They have celebrity because of him. They have power because of him. And so whether they believe everything he says is not up for me to decide, but it doesn't benefit them to not be loyal, just like he relies on them to be loyal. So sort of this like weird symbiotic relationship where they're all using each other.
And you and I have talked about this before. As we think about who comes after Donald Trump, there's a lot of conversation out there. Is it J.D. Vance? Is it somebody else? DeSantis, does he make a comeback? I remain convinced that Don Jr., right, that Donald Trump will do everything he can to get his family member as the next heir to the Republican Party, because that's how he protects himself. One thing we see, authoritarians never leave, right? When you look around the world, authoritarians, they have to dye their hair because you don't want to forget, you must forget how long they've been in office. But the reason they don't want to leave office is they'll be charged with crimes, they'll be killed or whatnot. So, the one way you avoid that is by putting your family in power. And I know a lot of people, you've sometimes giggled at me when I've said this, but I do think at some point we might see Donald Trump Jr. as a more serious presidential heir.
I don't giggle because you're not wrong. I sort of giggled out of fear at first, or I hadn't thought about it that way. But the other giggle in this is that, and we've talked about this a little bit, is that the MAGA movement in and of itself, once Trump can no longer be in office again, does it go away? Does it morph? Does it change? Don Jr. doesn't have the cult of personality that his father has. No. He doesn't have the... I don't even know how else to explain it other than that. He doesn't have the same pull that his father has. And so even if his father's out there saying he's just like me, I don't know that he gets the same kind of like vociferous support. Yes. Even if his dad is in the background, like, remember, he's mine.
There is something unique to Trump, the cult of personality. Even, whether one likes or dislikes Donald Trump, you oftentimes find him entertaining, right? Or even a little bit funny, right? There's something that you're drawn to him in a way that other Republicans and other members of the Trump family don't, right? I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about Venezuela. Hugo Chavez sort of had that, right? He was an authoritarian principal or actor who used the tools of democracy to undermine democracy. And then when he died, Maduro took over and he didn't have any of that. He doesn't have the charisma. He doesn't have the entertaining value. And they've continued to be an authoritarian system without that sort of charm, which is not a good thing to be thinking about in terms of the future of the United States. But I do think that Don Jr. is going to be around for a long time in terms of Republican circles. I
think it's clear that Eric doesn't have a future as president. I think we can discount him, perhaps.
Yes, and and other members, right? I mean, where do they want to see themselves? As we were driving in, we were talking about sometimes the grift is the point, right? And so the family members will stick around because Trump trusts them, but also because it's financially advantageous to remain in those corrupt cycles.
100%.
Yeah. Ed, we're up against the break. Any other final thoughts before we go?
Oh, yeah. Well, one thing I was going to bring up, you familiar with the book Conservatives in America, The Wrecking Crew?
I am not.
Okay. Well, it came out about 8 years ago, I believe, in 2008 by Tom Frank. And there's a chapter in there that one of the things that they use, Republicans throw, ridiculous statements or whatever against the wall, hoping a certain percentage of those are going to stick. And that's been a policy of theirs for years, going back to people like Newt Gingrich, Rush Limbaugh. They've used in their conversation, they have made these innuendos and whatever, and with no proof whatsoever. And they throw it out there, hoping that people will eat it up, and like I say, that's one of their policies.
It works very, very well. Ed, we got to go to break, but thank you so much for sharing that. You're absolutely right. And Donald Trump doesn't have a lot of discipline, but he's disciplined when it comes to the lies, right? He's very consistent with saying the same thing over and over again. So we got to hit a break here, but we will be back soon to talk more about Donald Trump and maybe some other things as well.
Some gobble gobble.
Yep.
The Thom Hartmann radio program provides all of the intelligence, information, and insight you'll need to win the water cooler wars. Weekdays 11 to 2 right here on WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter. Because facts matter. You're listening to WCPT 820.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Billion Today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. I'm William Muck, and I'm joined by Suzanne Chod as we're discussing all things political. Just want to remind everybody that tomorrow from 6 to 8 a.m., Richard Chu will be joined by Illinois State Senator Lakeisha Collins, and Wednesday morning, regular Kurt Mullett, a.k.a. Hoosier Blue 63. That's Chu's Views, weekday mornings from 6 to 8 a.m. on WCPT 820. While we were away, we got a texter in that said the last caller was right about Donald Trump's lies. The problem is nobody can keep up with him. He's lying as fast as we can write it down. And there's some truth to that, Suzanne. It's just
so true.
The pace is overwhelming.
Yes, and even when you watch the debates, and I always love Daniel Dale, who's the fact checker on CNN.
Yes.
He talks so fast because he has to say so much so quickly. Right. And even he has said, I can't keep up with all of them.
Yeah, we've never seen a politician like that before who just is so disconnected to truth and so indifferent to truth.
And it is a strategy.
Yeah.
And that it works.
Absolutely,
all
yes.
Of those things.
Yeah.
All of those things.
All right, well, let's go to Ron from Chicago who wants to talk about tariffs and immigration. Hey, Ron, how are you?
Oh, pretty good. Yes, Trump has said that he is raising tariffs on Canada and Mexico is because they are responsible for keeping out the undocumented migrants from the United States, and I don't see how that's going to help at all, raising tariffs.
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Economically, tariffs are a bad idea. Immigration, it was interesting today because the Mexican president was sort of clapping back at Donald Trump, saying that you're worried about illegal drugs coming into the United States from Mexico. You know what? Worried about all the illegal or the weapons that are produced in the United States that are crossing the border into Mexico that are fueling some of the drug wars. Mm-hmm. I mean, that border certainly has illicit products going both ways. Sure. Narcotics coming one way, weapons coming the other. Sure. And you can understand the Mexican position to say, hey, we also are concerned about this, and this isn't just a United States problem. And hey, we wish your demand for drugs wasn't so high because that would help us out a little bit as well.
And calling out Mexico makes perfect sense, but calling out Canada doesn't, that somehow like what's coming over the border from Canada is affecting us in terms of economically, or whether they're, immigrants are coming over from Canada and coming to the U.S. or coming through Canada into the U.S.
Yeah.
and it's the same thing that J.D. Vance said on the campaign trail. He said that, you know what's going to fix the housing crisis? Mass deportations.
Yeah.
So if we can just blame immigrants for everything, we will solve the problem.
You're right. It is curious because normally Trump is very clear about the ethnic group he's going to blame. And right, Canadians usually aren't thrown in that. So somebody must have gotten into his ear to say that. I mean, the old NAFTA, I can't remember the new acronym for the New Deal, is an agreement that Trump signed. Yes. This is something that came out of his administration.
He takes credit for it all the time.
Absolutely. And if they were to implement 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods, that would undermine the very agreement he established, and the United States would be, again, in violation of that.
Yeah, but he doesn't care.
You know, this is absolutely right.
I don't know what else to say.
No, you're 100% right. Other thoughts, Ron?
Yes, this so-called maybe there's an agreement between Israel and Lebanon. So if there is, how will that affect the Palestine and Gaza? Will they still be fighting over there, or how will that all come together?
Yeah. My understanding is that this is exclusively a deal between Israel and Hezbollah. So it's really dealing with the conflict that's playing out between Israel and Lebanon. It doesn't have any connection to what's going on in Gaza. Now, one hopes that creating space for an agreement in Lebanon may then translate and make it a little bit easier to deal with some of those concerns in Gaza. And what's interesting is Hezbollah had said that they were not open to an agreement on Lebanon until Gaza was addressed. So they've shifted positions. And so one hopes that maybe we're moving a little bit closer to that space, that kind of conversation. I will say I have no inside information on this, but knowing what we know about the Biden administration, they work diplomacy behind the scenes relentlessly. So I am sure they are trying to get some sort of deal on Gaza done. It doesn't mean they will be successful. But I'm sure Blinken is doing that. And I wouldn't be surprised, Suzanne, if by time Biden leaves office, we see some sort of Gaza deal. I think Biden would see that as a nice way to sort of leave office, is to have some sort of agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the defining things of his sort of the thing that defined his presidency initially was getting us back on our feet after COVID. Yeah. But then after that, I think what he would like to see happen, not for selfish reasons, but so he could sort of round out his time in office in general, but also like as a public servant, is to say that he was able to do something to end the war in Gaza. Yeah. And not to preserve a legacy for selfish reasons, but to say he did something good as he left. Yeah. And the sort of the way that he sort of bookended his presidency. And my fear, and I said this to you before, is if any of this happens, of course, it's good for everyone, but Donald Trump will find a way to take credit, right? To say, like, it's because I'm going to be president next, and Netanyahu knows he can't get away with this, or Hamas or Hezbollah are worried about this, that, or the other. That's why this is happening. It's not a Biden win.
And no, this is such a great point, right? And I think that Biden deserves a fair amount of credit for what's happened in Ukraine, right? I mean, for mobilizing NATO, for having a more full-fronted confrontation of Vladimir Putin. But he's been criticized, and in some ways rightfully so, for the inability to change things in the Middle East. And I think some of that is out of their control. Right. It's very easy to criticize the United States for not controlling everything when, in foreign policy, sometimes it's very difficult to do so. I think, both Hamas and Benjamin Netanyahu haven't been interested in agreement. And so in some ways it doesn't matter what Joe Biden wants if those parties aren't open to conversation. But again, I think he really cares about diplomatic achievements. He really wants to leave the world in a better place. So I think they will do everything to address that. But I'm at least pleased that we're seeing some movement in Lebanon, and hopefully that translates into some more movement in Gaza. Ron, anything else you want to share?
No, that's all. That's all for today.
Thanks so much for the call. We really appreciate it. Let's go to Michael in Chicago, who wants to talk about health care under the Trump administration. Hey, Michael.
Okay, hello.
Hey, Mike.
Again, you got me. But health care about the Trump administration?
Yes. You want to chat about health care under the Trump administration?
Okay, I feel that Trump and his buddy John Kennedy Jr., they're going to cut a lot of programs. They're going to try to cut health care, everything. Look at it. If Trump admits he wants to kick out 1 or 2 or 3 million people out of this country because they're illegal aliens, and that would be a humanitarian disaster, and the religious organizations don't oppose this, they should, on a moral basis, they should oppose this. If Trump's going to kick out 3 million people, he certainly wants to reduce all the other social welfare programs. So, like I say, he's going to reduce vaccinations. He's going to reduce the Medicaid program. I think he wants to cut the Medicaid program. I think he wants to reduce the Medicare program. And I think he wants to reduce a lot of programs. This is called austerity. He thinks there are too many welfare programs for the poor people. And the poor people especially are going to be hurt by this. So we got to get organized. We got to encourage people now. There's no election for a while, but we can tell people to call their congressmen, phone their state representatives, phone their state senators to try to stop the Trump programs, because he's going to cut these things. He's going to say it's too expensive. And he has a program now. One of his friends, Elon Musk, is in favor of efficiency, reducing costs, efficiency. Well, efficiency is a code word for him just to cut the programs for the poor people.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, Michael. I think we're moving towards an administration. We're going to see a retraction of those programs. Suzanne, I think between the two, healthcare and immigration, I think there's more of a consensus on immigration. I think even Democrats have moved to the right on some of those immigration issues, maybe because they just realize that's where the voters are. But healthcare I'm not so sure that's politically savvy to cut some of these programs. What do you think about if Republicans in the Trump administration start targeting some of these sort of very popular healthcare programs?
Well, and this is where the unengaged public comes in again, because it was interesting during the campaign where when Kamala Harris was campaigning, she would say, like, and we're all for the Affordable Care Act, which is Obamacare, and she would use them in the same sentence. And I'm like, everybody knows that's the same thing. Why is she doing that? Yeah. But it turns out that most people think that the ACA and Obamacare are different things.
Interesting.
And so they have widespread support for the Affordable Care Act. Republicans, Trump voters, widespread support for the Affordable Care Act. But they don't support Obamacare.
Because of the name.
Because that's really fascinating. And so what Harris was trying to do was say, like, hey, remember, these are the same thing.
Sure.
And so actually you like both of these things. And this president, when he was in office, tried to cut it and is going to cut it now. And we're the ones that actually put it into place. And so what I think is going to be difficult, because there are so many people, to the point of the caller, poor people, those who need the services, that rely on the exchange or rely on other kinds of federal health insurance policies, right, whether Medicaid or otherwise. And so cutting those across the board is going to be really challenging. It doesn't mean they're not going to try. But I think what Trump has said with concepts of a plan of making the Affordable Care Act better, I don't know what makes it better, because are they going to cut pre-existing condition coverage? They can't do that. Right. They've already gutted the individual mandate, so that isn't something they can take out of it anymore. So what is it that's going to make it better? He said, we're going to make it cheaper. So how are they going to make it cheaper? Sure. And if you can, I would support that.
Sure, absolutely.
But I just need to see what that looks like.
No, that's right. And he has, as time has gone by, he's gone from trying to undermine that program to now taking credit for that program.
He said.
Yes, absolutely. So it's a really, I do think that that may be something that they don't touch, right? Immigration seems like something, it sort of fits his program and the ugliness and the racism and all of that. Yes. But healthcare feels like he could actually get himself in some trouble if he pushes too hard on that one. Because that, as you said, the ACA is now central to a lot of people's existence. It's grown, and we've grown to love it. That could be a bad move on his part. So.
And what I could see him doing, interestingly, is to start talking about the Affordable Care Act now and saying, look at how many people are covered, look at how well they're doing, and people are going to be like, oh my God, this is great.
This is really interesting, yeah. Well, we got to go to a break. Michael, thank you so much for the call, and we'll be back in just a couple of minutes to talk about everything.
Around the Town, Chicago, with Al Betzloff.
My dog eats dog food now. Bravo. She eats good. She does kibble and she does wet. But everything has to be topped with the farm to pet topping. You just sprinkle it on the top of her food. She comes running to it and starts gobbling up her food. I've even tried it. It's really...
And Frank's doing much better now. Okay.
He's really good.
His hair is shiny.
Sunday afternoons at 1 on WCPT 820. Hey, Google, play WCPT.
Streaming Chicago's progressive talk from TuneIn.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. I'm William Muck, and I'm joined by Suzanne Chod, and we're talking all things politics. And we just had a really nice text from somebody who said, I'm enjoying the current discussion. Great job. Suzanne, I love when the texters enjoy the conversation. So
same.
This is great. So let's go out we've got Bonnie out in St. Charles who wants to talk about the Trump sons and the Trump family. Hey, Bonnie, how are you?
I'm good. I'm really enjoying your show, but I wanted to interject that I think Trump knows exactly how stupid his boys are, because he's been quoted as saying many, many times that when brains were passed out, his boys were at the back of the room. And I think that's why they're so entranced by J.D. Vance, because, you know, Kamal Bell says J.D. stands for just dumb. So those boys are really stupid.
No, this is really, you're bringing an important point, Bonnie. Like, I do not think that Don Jr. is on the cutting edge of like any intellectualism at all, right? No. But he is. That's
not the brand, though.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, he is a defender. Yeah. He will stand up for Donald Trump. We've talked about loyalty. I mean, his loyalty is the most important thing there, right? Yeah. That matters more than anything else.
Okay, can we talk about his cocaine habit? That's why I think he gets his confidence and is so chatty. But
there have been a lot of videos and rumors going on about that. You know, you can't speculate on any of those things, but certainly there is some unique behavior out of Don Jr., that's for sure.
Yes. So thank you for listening. I love your show.
Well, thank you so much for calling in, Bonnie. This has been wonderful. No, I keep coming back to this issue of loyalty, and you know, as we think about patterns across the nominees for his cabinet, right? Loyalty is number one. We were talking a little before we came on the show, the role of misogyny and sexism, and we got a little bit of time. I think I want to create some space for Suzanne to kind of reflect on these patterns, because we've seen, I mean, you know, a number of sexual assault allegations that have been levied. What are you seeing in terms of the pattern of gender among these nominees?
So there's, I don't know. It's like
Where to start?
I know, it's so crazy. So I guess I'll just start with this, is that one of the things, and you and I have talked about this, and I do this in all of my classes, is that when a group that didn't have rights initially starts to gain some traction, and they don't have the same rights, they're not treated equally, but they're at least gaining some power, we see these countermeasures, is typically what we call them. Sometimes they're legal countermeasures, like, you know, overturning Roe versus Wade. Sometimes they're violent countermeasures with increases in sexual assault and other violations of women's bodies. But these countermeasures are a direct result of a group of people who got power, who it feels like they're now replacing the people who had it. So people who feel that way, we say, have hostily sexist tendencies. They think, in this case, women are replacing men. Mm-hmm. And so what we've seen in this election in particular is that Trump is sort of unabashedly toxically masculine, right? His physical presence, the way he speaks, the way he every time talks about a woman starts with her appearance. Mm-hmm. Every single time.
So this isn't an accident.
No.
Okay.
And he's a reflection of a generation of men, you know, for example, but also he's attractive to a younger generation of men who feel that their way of life has become irrelevant, or the way of life of their fathers, or the way of life that is supposed to unfurl itself for them. That is becoming harder for them, but easier for women. And so one of the ways in which this manifests is, let's put a bunch of bros in the White House to show that they are the ones that are supposed to have power. And yes, someone will come back at me and say, but what about Tulsi Gabbard? But what about Pam Bondi? Yes, there are women in the White House as well. But there's also a tendency for women, especially white women, when they're given any crumb of power, to take it because they have it, because they can have it.
And as we think about the most significant post, right? The Department of Defense, that's a big one. And putting Pete Hegseth there, I think that says something. And then as these allegations come out, Trump doesn't run away from them. Same thing with Matthew Gaetz. I mean, arguably the two most important, Attorney General and Department of Defense, he has put individuals who embrace and typify that bro culture, even when there are allegations that would have ended you go back in history and think about candidates cabinet nominees who've been removed. I mean, for far less things, not paying taxes, those sort of things.
DUI.
Right, exactly right. I mean, these are dramatic things. So what you're saying is that this isn't an accident, that they're embracing that sense of masculinity, and that this is sending a signal to the country. This is the direction we want to move.
And it is attractive to men who identify as highly masculine. It's attractive, the data suggests, to women who identify as highly feminine.
Sure.
And so his message of, I'm going to protect you whether you want it or not, that a woman like me, that turns me off. Don't protect me because I don't need you to, and don't tell me you're going to do something I don't even want you to do, or I'm going to ask you to do. But there are people that is really attractive. And so if he surrounds himself with men like that, then we will be protected and taken care of as a country, especially if you're the top law enforcement agent or you're heading the Department of Defense. And if I could just add, the culture in the military of sexual assault and harassment, and the person that's going to be overseeing some of these things is charged with those things. I worry about the message that sends for so many reasons.
Well, absolutely. And Hegseth's approach to this is he has argued that the military has become feminized, right?
Yes.
There's too much DEI. I mean, he's not talking about, different strategies or any of that. He's saying that he's bringing the culture war to the U.S. military, which, let's be honest, is not, I would not describe the U.S. military as fully feminized, right? I mean, this is a hardened organization, oftentimes, much more conservative than the academy would be. And it's really curious, right? And I think the point you're making about when we see trends, right? So when we see improvement in women's rights, when you see women getting, jobs and education, all these other things and making some real progress, this is when you see the backlash, right? And so some of this is to be understood in this historic push and pull as we move towards extending some of those rights.
Because it reconsiders all of this, right? Is that because these countermeasures can be legal and non-legal and violent and social, and we're seeing in all of the spaces, we're seeing the legal ways in which women are having pushback, right? Yeah. And then if we're seeing, again, this culture in the White House saying this is who should have power, and that people are like, that looks good to me, I'll take that. Yeah. That trickles into women's everyday lives and minoritized people their everyday lives. And because there was a statistic I was telling you earlier to make sure I get it right, that 30% of Republican men say that women's gains have come at the expense of men. So this is what hostile sexism literally is. It's that when women do better, quote, do better, that they're taking over. And so 30% is a lot of people. Yeah. And there's other things and these data about how we look at masculinity. They're very telling about now the thought is that women are the problem because women were, quote, given rights. Yeah. And now it's harder for me as a man to have the power I so rightly deserve.
Sure.
So I'm looking at you.
No, that's right. Absolutely right. And then I feel the victim, right?
Yes,
you have taken away these rights from me. And we should say this is not something that's just exclusive to the United States, right? We have seen this around the world. Erica Chenoweth, who's this wonderful scholar at Harvard, has written about this, and she talks about the return of the patriarchy and argues that some of the authoritarian tendencies we've seen in places like Russia, Hungary, Venezuela, the United States, Mexico, elsewhere, is tied up to the advancement of women's rights. That as these have moved forward, you are seeing a group of toxic masculine men who are embracing these more traditional alpha male roles do really well through the democratic process because segments of the society are uncomfortable with this change, right? And so anytime you have change, whether that's demographic change or political change or globalization, all of these dynamics are changing. People are looking for someone, to your earlier point, who will protect them. And if we were going to grow somebody like that in a lab, right, it would be Donald Trump. He fits that so perfectly.
And that's what also, it's interesting, the data suggests that for people, again, who either identify as highly masculine or who value masculine qualities, those qualities they value are physical strength, risk-taking, and assertiveness. Those are three things you cannot use to describe a woman. Because if you do, she's the B word, she's this, she's that, she's all these other things. So when you look at Kamala Harris, a woman of color, standing next to Donald Trump, and you look at them and say, okay, which one of these people is physically stronger? I would actually probably suggest Kamala Harris is physically stronger. But who's going to be more of a risk taker? Who's going to be more assertive? And Trump is talking about tariffs and all these risky things. That sounds good to me.
It's, every once in a while I find myself thinking back to that presidential debate. And if you were sort of removed yourself from the partisan environment of the United States and you just watched that debate, it would be very clear who was the better candidate, right? Yes. I mean, separate from partisanship and all those other things. And so you can't really understand the 2024 presidential election without appreciating the role of gender and sexism and all of these dynamics that were driving this. And not just the campaign itself, but as you're pointing out, this is what the 4 years of governance is going to look like. This is going to be front and center for Trump administration.
That's right. And I think back to the debate as well, where I heard a couple of women in my life say, like, she wasn't, the faces she was making, she just wasn't presidential. She was so silly, and when she was acting just like not presidential. But I asked some of these people, like, well, did you hear what he said before she made those faces? And they did not. Yeah. So this expectation of it's okay for men to act in a particular way, and we would want them to act in that way because that means they're strong and they'll take care of us and they'll be good. They'll engage in good governance. but I smirk, and I am disqualified.
It's stunning, right? And you saw so many times where you saw women saying that a woman shouldn't be president, right? This is, I mean, it really is sort of shocking when you think about the progress and then realize that, for 2 steps forward, always 1 step back. This is the reality we're facing. So, well, thank you, Barbara. Bonnie, you got us thinking about some really, really interesting topics here. We got to go to a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking to Barbara McQuade, and we're so excited about this. We're going to be talking about disinformation, the Trump administration, and also some sort of broader legal dynamics. So we will be right back with Barbara McQuade.
The Sports Cubicle. Economics professor at Smith College, Massachusetts, Andrew Zimbalist.
When Chicago is approached, or Illinois is approached for new public funds to build yet another stadium, it shouldn't be, hey, this is going to be an economic boon for the city. It's not going to be. It should be, how much is it worth to us culturally to keep these teams here?
The Sports Cubicle with Mike Mercado, Devin Tingle, Dan Marver, and Paul Shivari. Sunday nights, 9 p.m. on WCPT.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll. Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We're just working out some technical details with Barbara McQuade, and she'll be joining us soon. While we're waiting for that, Suzanne, we were talking about toxic masculinity and the way in which gender played a role. As you think about the election results, obviously gender played a role. Are there other things that we're figuring out that help us understand the election results?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about whether we're in this realignment period, right? Because we saw, Latin men vote more for the Republican Party. We've seen the last couple election cycles, black men voting more for the Republican Party. Yeah. We saw new voters, younger voters, male vote, all of the things, right? Yeah. So really, except for older women and men, Trump did better this time than with other members of the electorate and other groups. I think it's too soon to obviously say that we're in a realignment. That takes decades to suggest it. But what it does say to us is that that the electorate is changing in ways we need to pay attention to. And I think what's interesting is that we won't really know if it's changing as a reaction to Trump himself or if the members of the electorate, these different groups, are actually changing in their predispositions. And so I'm 4 years out or more of any kind of real prognostication about that. But I want to watch this.
Yes, and see where those numbers play out. Paul, are we good to go? All right, so we are so excited to be joined by our next guest, Barbara McQuade. Barbara is a professor from practice at Michigan Law. She served as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, appointed by President Barack Obama. She was the first woman to serve in her position and oversaw cases involving public corruption, terrorism, corporate fraud, theft of trade secrets, civil rights, healthcare fraud, you name it, and she was dealing with it. Our listeners will no doubt recognize Barbara from her work as a legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. She's the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Attack from Within, How Disinformation Is Sabotaging America. Welcome to the show, Barbara. We are so happy that you can join us.
Well, thank you so much. That glowing introduction has probably taken up all our time.
No,
we'll make more. Don't worry.
It had to be done. Yeah. So
very kind.
We want to spend most of our time kind of discussing the practice of disinformation and what it means for electing and then the governance of Donald Trump. But we couldn't pass up the opportunity to get your reaction to Jack Smith seeking and then the judge agreeing to dismiss these 2 federal cases against Donald Trump. What do you see as the significance of this development?
Yeah, well, big picture, it means these cases really are effectively over, and I think that's got to be very frustrating to court watchers and probably very gratifying to Donald Trump. But I think it's important to understand some of the nuance here. Number one, Jack Smith states explicitly this has nothing to do with the merits of the case or the strength of the evidence. This is simply because the Department of Justice has rendered the opinion that a sitting president can be neither indicted nor prosecuted while they're serving in office. But one important thing that he did in this motion is to request that it be dismissed without prejudice. And that is what the court ordered, that it be dismissed without prejudice, which means it can be brought again. Mm-hmm. So there's no exoneration, there's no double jeopardy preclusion. It can be brought again. He even said that the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice has said that what's called equitable tolling should apply to the statute of limitations. So even though that might run in 5 years, it should be paused during those 4 years that Donald Trump is in office. So at least theoretically, I don't know that there will be the appetite to do so, but Donald Trump is not off the hook, and a new attorney general in 2029 could renew these cases if they so choose.
Do you think it's likely that we will see, will there be a report? Is there any way that Jack Smith will share some of this information? Or because there could be a future prosecution, does he hold off and not do that?
I think he's likely to issue one in the January 6th case, but not in the documents case. And here's the reason I say that. The special counsel regulations say that when the special counsel's work is done, he should issue a report. He dismissed the documents case as to Donald Trump only. There are two other defendants in that case. And the case they're asking to continue there because, of course, the issue is on appeal before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals on the issue as to whether special counsel regulations are unconstitutional. And I think the Department of Justice has a continued interest in litigating that issue going forward. We'll see whether the new Trump administration agrees or disagrees or pardons those two. But because that's ongoing, I think Jack Smith may be reluctant to issue a report there. However, in the January 6th case, it seems to me that he is wrapping up his own work. It is dismissed, and even though the case could be refiled down the road, I think it's quite possible we will see a final report. Now, it may be that there's not much new here between what we saw with the January 6th Congressional Committee and what Jack Smith himself has revealed in the very detailed indictment and all of the motions that got filed. But there could be some new nuggets there that he wants to share with the public, so that would be an opportunity to do that. So I think we're likely to see it in the January 6th case, but not in the documents case.
Well, and this is so interesting because one of the things you brought up was the power of the Attorney General, right? So the person that oversees the Department of Justice and what they might want to do in 2029. But I would love to, Bill, and I would love to get your take on the potential Attorney General starting in 2025. The two picks that Trump has put forward, one who's no longer under consideration, but Pam Bondi, who still is, we would consider them unconventional, perhaps. And so we'd love to get your take on what you think of these Attorney General picks and where Trump was at with all of it.
Yeah, so Matt Gaetz was an unmitigated disaster. In fact, I'm not sure he was ever a real choice. It may have been just an honorable way to get him out from under the ethics investigation at the House because he was able to immediately resign, after he was picked for Attorney General. He had like 2 years of legal practice experience, never been a prosecutor, never worked in a large office, had no management leadership role whatsoever, and, of course, these allegations of sexual misconduct. So glad to see him go. I think Pam Bondi is better, but when you set the bar so low, lots of people would be better. I think she has the requisite experience. She worked for many years as a line attorney, as a prosecutor in the trenches, and I think that's very good experience for understanding what that's really like. And then she led a large office, the Attorney General's office for the state of Florida. So I think that is sufficient experience. I'd like to see somebody with federal experience and maybe even a leadership role in the Department of Justice. But that's a quibble. I think she's qualified in terms of her experience. The things that concern me are, number one, concerns about her integrity, and number two, concerns about her partisan politics. So integrity, I think the Senate committee needs to look into this allegation that she accepted a $25,000 campaign contribution from the Trump Foundation while she was investigating Trump University and then dropped that investigation 4 days later. She was cleared by the Florida Ethics Committee, but that could be a different thing. Just because you're cleared by on ethical issues by a state bar doesn't mean you're suitable to serve as the nation's Attorney General. So I'd like to see some more scrutiny there. Now, maybe it really is just a coincidence and one has nothing to do with the other, but I think it's worth looking at there to make sure this is not someone whose integrity can be compromised by $25,000. The other would be the partisan politics of Donald Trump. Now, certainly most attorneys general share the political worldview of the president who selects them. It's no surprise that he chooses a Republican. It's no surprise that he chooses someone aligned with his viewpoints. I mean, after all, John F. Kennedy chose his brother to be the attorney general. But post-Watergate, we have norms about independence of the Justice Department from the White House in an effort to protect even the perception of impropriety and integrity at the Justice Department. And I worry about some of the things she has said, like we're going to prosecute the prosecutors of Donald Trump. There is simply no evidence of any sort of misconduct. They may not have liked those prosecutions, but there's nothing to suggest there was anything improper about them. And, she participated in election denialism as well. I'd like to know a little more about that, her thinking there, her strategy there, and a full review of all of the things she has said. Saying things to advance a political cause are fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you are misrepresenting facts and stepping on the rule of law, I think that could be disqualifying for somebody who wants to be the Attorney General. So I think we need to see some serious scrutiny there by the Senate Judiciary Committee. The idea that there could be recess appointments, I think, would be a very bad idea. And the fact that Gates had to withdraw and that, more than, it's like 8 senators, including a number of Republican senators, said that they would not confirm him, gives me a little more hope that the Senate is not going to be a rubber stamp here, that they are going to do their job to provide advice and consent.
One of the things that worries me a little bit about Bondi is how often they talk about her as being a loyalist, right? Because when you think about Attorney General, you want somebody who's independent. And, as you were talking, I was thinking of Merrick Garland. And I was curious about, after sort of reflecting on his tenure, there are a lot of liberals who are very critical of Garland, saying he should have been more confrontational, should have gone after Trump. But he strikes me as somebody who didn't want to be a loyalist, right? Just wanted to pursue the cases as they presented themselves. How do you think we'll remember Garland's legacy? I mean, will he be somebody who was just from a different time, or what do you think about his time?
Yeah, I hope not. I hope that we one day see that Garland was a shining example of the independence of the Department of Justice, and that we get back to it.
Yeah.
And that, some of these other things, like, William Barr interfering with some cases with Michael Flynn and Roger Stone, who were Trump loyalists. I hope we get back to a time when we say, Merrick Garland did it just right. I understand that frustration because I think there are people who think that if he had simply started earlier, he could have secured a conviction of Donald Trump before the election. I'm not sure that would have mattered, and I'm not sure that's true because I think we still have at least one more round back to the Supreme Court to apply the immunity decision. So even if the indictment had been filed a year earlier, I'm not sure we would have finished it in time for the election. And it's not really the role of the Department of Justice to save America from candidates they shouldn't vote for.
Right. That's our job.
The way to defeat a candidate is at the ballot box. So I think he did his job. I think he did his job with integrity. I think he did it with independence. I think if I have one criticism of Merrick Garland is I would like to have seen him out there explaining more frequently what he was doing. He did do it from time to time. Like the anniversary of the January 6th attack, he kind of gave a progress report and talked about how they build cases and tried to assure the public that this is based on facts and evidence and not on politics. I would like to have seen him do more of that because I think when you are silent, it is easy for other people to characterize you and label you, whether it was the progressive side labeling him as too soft, or it was Trump supporters saying that he was engaging in lawfare. I think the more you communicate, the more you can address those concerns. And so that was a bit old school, and I think maybe needs to adapt to the modern day. Old school is we speak through our court documents. And I think that, in today's 24/7 political chattering classes, maybe we need to talk a little more. And I would have liked a little more explaining of what he was doing. I think he probably did more than his predecessors, but I think he probably need to do even more than he did.
Well, and it's interesting as you were talking because Bill and I talked about this earlier, and there was a caller that suggested that, had Merrick Garland, as you said, done all of these things earlier, that perhaps we wouldn't have gotten Donald Trump as president a second time. And I think some of that is trying to explain away or try to feel better because we're so disillusioned, some of us, with Trump's victory. And so one of the things that you noted when you wrote a piece for Time recently is that we need to fight the temptation to disengage from politics. Bill and I talk about this all the time. And you argue that defending democracy and the truth and the actions that are required to defend democracy. So I'd love for you to talk about why this is so important. You're talking to two civic educators who do this every day and who are confronted with disinformation in our classrooms. We would love to have you talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah, I think this is the most important takeaway from the election. I have so many friends who say, understandably, I'm exhausted. I just can't. It's too much. It's too toxic. And I most certainly understand that. And in fact, if it's, it may be healthy to step away from the 24/7 news fire hose that fires at us all the time and, get out in nature, spend time with family, and do things that attend to your mental wellness. But at some point, we got to get back on the democracy horse. This is a participatory democracy. And if we cede our power, then those who aren't tired and aren't exhausted are going to control the world in ways we don't like. And so we have to participate. We have to vote. We have to stay informed. We have to talk with our neighbors. And we have the ability to shape policy, certainly at our local level, with our members of Congress. Members of Congress are very responsive to letters and emails and phone calls that they get because they want to get reelected. And so I think we can't disengage from politics. And that, after all, really is the ultimate goal of disinformation. Sometimes it is to convince you that something false is true, but you'll see frequently just an undermining of confidence in the institutions like the press, conflicting, inconsistent claims. Donald Trump will tell you one thing on Monday and another on Tuesday, and people say, what a hypocrite. Which is it? But he'll also tell you that everyone is corrupt, that they're all a bunch of dishonest politicians, and you can't believe any of them. And I think that's where the goal is, to exhaust us, to make us cynical, and to make us feel like we can't control the outcome anyway. And, I'm going to focus on my family and my job and the things I can control, and the rest of it, I'm just not going to pay attention anymore. And when we disengage from politics, we have allowed the forces, the anti-democratic forces, to prevail over the rest of us. And so I know it can be painful for a while, and maybe we need to, rest and recover a little bit. But ultimately, I hope we all get back and engage in politics, because it's what we need to do to make our nation thrive and truly serve the people.
This is such an important message. I'm glad you said that. So we need to take a quick little break, but we will be right back with Barbara McQuade.
WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk, where facts matter.
Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll. Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. I'm William Muck, and I'm joined by Dr. Suzanne Chod, and we are having a wonderful conversation with Barbara McQuade, and we were talking about some legal dynamics in the Trump administration, but then we began to talk about disinformation, this book that Barbara McQuade has written. And so, Barbara, I wanted to ask you about the Trump 2024 campaign, and you wrote that Trump's ugly and deceitful campaign tactics worked, that he fed the electorate disinformation to stoke fear and division in society, and that it propelled him to the White House. And why do you think this was so effective? It's sort of disheartening that something that's so dangerous can be so effective. What's your read on all of that?
Yeah. And, first, I do want to acknowledge that there are multiple reasons that Donald Trump won this election. I think disinformation is part of it. Mm-hmm. But there are all kinds of reasons. I think there's some sexism. I think there's some racism. I think there is some concern of, working class Americans with economic dissatisfaction, with inflation. So there are a lot of them. But I do think a significant portion of Donald Trump's strategy is disinformation. So, people are dissatisfied with their place in the economy. Certainly understandable. But the reason they are dissatisfied with their place in the economy, Donald Trump would tell you, is because of immigrants. It is us versus them. Immigrants are what are causing you to have this economic hardship. In fact, the reason that we see economic hardship among our middle and lower classes is because of the huge income disparities we have in this country. Mm-hmm. Tax policy since the 1980s, corporate tax cuts again and again and again, skyrocketing CEO salaries, moving manufacturing offshore. These are the reasons that we see certain segments of society suffer economically. But instead of acknowledging those things, Donald Trump and others will point to immigrants. They will point to minorities, right, with this phrase of black jobs, that there's certain jobs for white people and certain jobs for black people. DEI, the idea that somehow diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are causing other people to lose out on jobs. These are all the use of disinformation to stoke anger and grievance and division in society. Even one of Trump's most successful ads, we saw it a lot here in Michigan, where we're a purple swing state. Maybe you saw less of it there in Illinois, where you're solidly blue. But we saw this one about how Kamala Harris was favoring gender-affirming medical care in prisons, which is true. But it was also true during Trump's administration, because that's the law. And the tagline was, Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for us. That was a classic tactic of disinformation, which is to divide society into only two categories. There's us and there's them. And framing people like the transgender community, the LGBTQ community, and immigrants as the enemy was a deliberate tactic, a huge part of Trump's strategy, and it appears that part of the strategy was very effective.
Well, what you described, Barbara, is something we talk about in political science called racialized economic anxiety. And so this blaming of outsiders, people of color, for your lot in life, so to speak, this idea of white grievance. And while Trump wasn't the first one to ever use this, it seems like the same strategy of blaming others for your lot in life extended to the 1% of the transgender community, for example, with all of those ads that we also saw here in Illinois. And so why do you think that it's so effective for Trump specifically to use this type of strategy? And why is he so active in using it as almost his only strategy? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that he understands that there is a segment of American society that does feel left behind, and he wants to speak to them. He wants to engage with them. It reminds me of a tactic used in South Africa when they were engaging in apartheid. Not only did they have, rules that favored whites over blacks, they deliberately stoked division among the black tribes so that they would never come together. Because if they ever came together, they would be a powerful majority over the white minority. And in the same way, I think that if in this country we ever had, lower to mid economic white people join forces with lower to mid-level economic earning minority people, that would be a powerful coalition. And so how do you prevent that group from voting against you? By stoking division among that. Pick off the minorities as the enemy in an effort to cultivate support by the white majority, because, if you can count, there are more of them than there are of any single minority. And it can be a winning strategy. So a coalition of the religious right, big business, hedge funds, Wall Street investors, CEOs who want to keep their tax rates low, and this group of people who are susceptible to white grievance makes the third part of the trifecta there. And so I think it's an essential part of his coalition. So to get their support, he stokes division between them and others who might be inclined to be very similarly situated economically.
That's so interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking about, you reference a scholar in one of your writings where he talks about Putin and describes the tactic of creating, quote, the fog of unknowability. And when I read that, I almost fell off my chair, because the point is, we don't believe or know anything. And that strikes me as Trump's ultimate goal, because if you create that universe where we can't trust in facts, or we can't trust in knowledge, or trust the media, it's much easier to control the narrative. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by that, the idea of the fog of unknowability?
Yeah, so I think this idea of sharing with people conflicting claims so that people don't know what to think.
Yeah, it's a fire hose. It's another kind of fire hose.
With regard to the 2020 election, trying to disprove a negative, right?
Yeah.
There was no fraud in the 2020 presidential election. Yeah, well, prove it. It's difficult to know that. You'll hear all these conflicting claims that don't even make logical sense, right? The 2020 election was stolen because voting machines flipped votes, or ballots were stuffed, or ballots were stolen. And yet in those very same districts, we saw Republicans elected to seats in Congress, in the Senate, in the House. And none of those people complained.
Sure. Right.
Hey, you know what? I won my race, but it must have been fraudulent because I was on the same ballot as Donald Trump. So there's not a lot of logic to all of it. So there's so much of these conflicting claims and disinformation and spin, and some of it is partly true. And so, like the Hunter Biden laptop is a great example. There's so much going on there. What's true? What's not true? Nobody knows. But it becomes this metaphor for lies. And, people just toss it out there as a shorthand without even knowing what does it even mean. But, I think people on the right and the left use it as a shorthand for different reasons.
Sure.
And I guess that's sort of the fog of unknowability, but it leads to that same place, that place of exhaustion, of people feeling like they're all corrupt, they all lie, I can't keep up with it anyway, and so I'm just going to disengage from politics. And again, I think we can't allow that to happen. I think social media and the internet really fuels that because there's so much information flying around there. I think we all experience information overload where we can barely keep up with all the things we want to read. I don't know about you, but I subscribe to all these like newsletters and news feeds from all the various media outlets, which is great, but my inbox every day is like hundreds of things I have to read, and it feels like I'm Lucy and Ethel on the assembly line reading all of it. So I understand that feeling.
Yeah, no, it becomes too much. So we got like a minute left. So could you offer some what should we do moving forward? We want to stay active. Is there a suggestion or two you would suggest to our listeners? How do we continue to confront disinformation?
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of legislative proposals. I don't know that those are going anywhere in the near future. So I'll focus on the things we can control. And I think they are these. One is media literacy. I think we need to improve our media literacy with kids, as they do in Finland very successfully, and with adults, through radio programs, through libraries, through faith communities, civic organizations, community colleges. There are a lot of places where we can teach good media literacy. So people, when they read things, they might be skeptical, but not completely discounting everything they read. So I think that's one. The other is civic engagement, getting out there and joining something so that when we see people who may have differences, may have different political views, we don't tend to demonize them. We understand that we're all in this world together. We all have more in common than we do difference. And I think if we get out there, out from behind our computers, and actually meet people across difference, we are less inclined to see others as the enemy.
Lots of smiles over here, Barbara, right? Civic education really is so important. Thank you so much. Remember, we've been talking with Barbara McQuade, who's a professor from practice at Michigan Law and who's a former U.S. attorney. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us. This has been so enlightening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we're off to a break, and we'll be back, and maybe we can talk about elections again.
I think we should.
Hey, where's Hal Sparks? I'm not sure where he is now, but I know where you can find him Saturdays at 11. He'll be right here on WCPT 820 for the Hal Sparks radio program, Mega Worldwide. This is WCPT 820, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. I'm William Muck, and I'm joined by my political science colleague, Suzanne Chod, and we've been talking about all the things. Just want to remind the listeners about some new podcasts. So Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive, now has its very own podcast. Two, actually. Joan Esposito full episodes and Joan Esposito featured interviews. You can subscribe to one or both. The podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and Amazon. It's everywhere. Just search for Joan Esposito or get the links on Joan's show page by visiting theheartlandsignal.com and clicking on her picture. The full episode feed will include this show and Fridays when I'm back here filling in for Joan. Because sometimes you want to listen to an episode twice, Suzanne.
You got to get as much Bill Muck as you possibly can.
That's right. Well, you can have too much, though. So, well, one of the things, actually, that Barbara McQuade interview was really fascinating. What a great perspective. Yes. I like the idea of saying that even though we're tired, even though we're disillusioned and frustrated with the democracy, you have to continue to fight for democracy and fight disinformation.
We have to.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we wanted to do, there was a clip that went around. Brian Williams, who was on Seth Meyers, and he was talking about why the Democrats lost. And I saw this, and I got grumpy. And then I sent it to you, and you got grumpy.
I got grumpier, I think,
right. So we thought we might play that and then kind of talk about our reactions to that. Paul, could you play that for us?
It is tough love time for the Democratic Party. I think it needs to be stripped down and rebuilt. I think that means a change in leadership. I want to know who thought it was a good idea that Joe Biden stand for another 4 years at 80 years of age and 37% popularity. So then that saddled the party with a British-like short campaign season for them. I think it's insulting when members of the working class, which the Democratic Party has lost entirely in our lifetimes, to insist the economy is doing great. A 12-pack of Bounty is $40. Rich folks don't feel that. Poor folks already switched to Sparkle during the during the lockdown. And I think telling them that the NASDAQ is gangbusters is further insulting. It's insulting. I think the biggest unforced error of the Biden administration by far was the border. To tell people it's not a problem is insulting. For the working class to see incoming migrants getting welcome bags, debit cards, and motel rooms is probably insulting as well. So there's a lot of work to do. You know, it was when they handed out camo hats that said Harris Walls, and the Democrats they were kind of charmed by that. Their party has gone quinoa, and the rest of America's eating at Cracker Barrel. And so it was kind of an ironic use of something millions of Americans put on their heads to start their day every day.
Now, Suzanne, this is not everything he says I disagree with, right? I mean, I think there's a real conversation to be had about Joe Biden running for re-election. Those are fair points. I think what kind of rubbed me the wrong way was his conversation, or I should say his points about the working class. And I, since you were a little more lathered up about this than I was, maybe I'll let you start in and kind of react to this idea that the Democratic Party just abandoned the working class.
Right. Well, oh my God, there's so many things. And so if we'll start here that when
you should actually just put your quinoa down.
I know. Hold on. I got to make my Whole Foods bag in the corner. My Prius is parked outside. It is so frustrating as a political scientist, and I feel you feel the same way. But someone who studies the things that I study, when anyone says like, "Oh, it's about the working class," it's about the working class, because what they're really saying is it's about the white working class. And so what we end up with, and in some ways this is what Barbara McQuade was just talking about, is that we pit minoritized groups against one another so that they fight for the scraps that are left from those who are in the power structure. And so to suggest that the Democratic Party has abandoned the working class, what he's really saying is at the expense of helping prop up those who've never had rights, people of color, other minoritized people. And so whether he's doing it on purpose, he's stoking the division that exists and said, hey, Democratic Party, you went too all in on equity, and not like the DEI equity, but like actually trying to level the playing field that was never level in the first place or intended to be. And in doing so, you abandon all the whiteys. And so you need to really strip down and start over again. That's what I heard from that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because you're thinking about it's a one, or you can't have both, right? You can't have working class whites and communities of color both get ahead at the same time. And the tone that Williams is presenting suggests that the Democratic Party should prioritize the white working class. And again, and the other thing that I think struck me is problematic is that he suggested the Democratic Party abandoned the working class. Right. When you think about Joe Biden, I mean, there's been a lot of Democratic presidents. I can't think of one who was more focused on the working class, who passed actual legislation thinking about the working class that led to actual improvements in the conditions of the working class. Right. I mean, the guy was on the labor lines, right? I mean, I think he was the only president who's ever been on the picket line. And so to suggest that the Democrats abandoned the white working class, I think it's missing the causality here, right? There is no question that the white working class is no longer connecting with the Democratic Party in the way that it used to.
That's fair.
But I think more of of that is self-selection, right? They are saying we're looking for something else. Yes. I think to your point, there are racial dynamics to this, right? So white working class men may find Donald Trump more appealing. What he is selling is something that they want. Yeah. But I don't think it's fair for Williams to suggest that the Democrats are the one that made this choice, right? Because they're thinking about Democrats have a Big Ten party. It's complicated. It is a hard thing to address all of the communities that fall within that Big Ten.
And it's all of that, but it's also this like lack of understanding of how campaigns work and how they're run. And so if what he was actually suggesting was that the vice president, the current vice president, who is linked to an unpopular incumbent president, should come out and say, y'all, I haven't done enough for 4 years. Eggs are too expensive. Gas is too expensive. We shouldn't be figuring out ways for passive citizenship and having sort of, treating migrants with respect and really getting at the root cause of migration. I was wrong. Mm-hmm. And so she should have run a campaign, or that the party, in quotes, should have run a campaign where she shot herself, for lack of a better euphemism, shot herself in the foot. Now, did she do the best job of saying, we did all these things and we can do more? That's not for me to say. Sure. But it's short-sighted in the communities he's talking about, but it's really short-sighted in thinking about how campaigns are run. Yeah. And also, I never heard her talk about the NASDAQ. Did you ever hear her talk about the NASDAQ? So that also was like, I don't know where he heard that.
Well, this is important, right? Because as we think about the campaigns, and I think there have been a lot of Democrats or liberals who've been frustrated, but they say, well, Harris should have done more, should have done this. The reality is she probably did that. Yeah. It just didn't break into your bubble, right? We're all in these different communities, and they had $1 billion, and they ran a lot of campaigns, and they targeted a lot of different populations, and penetrated those populations. A lot, $200 million, I think, was spent on working class ads. Yeah. Now, that didn't work, right? And that's still a question for Democrats to grapple with, is how do you try to entice some of these voters back? But I think the idea that the Democratic Party abandoned them rather than finding some other sort of candidate more appealing is that matters, right? Thinking about the causality of it.
It does. And it's also, it doesn't give the context, the larger context of like the way that Clinton built his coalition in the early 1990s that included all of the communities that Brian Williams is saying can't be in the same coalition, but not talking about the ways in which it started to fray after Clinton was out of office and when Obama came in, and we started seeing this activation of white grievance and white racial resentment and the racialized economic anxiety that Trump tapped into. And so there's like all of these things, right? And the coalition that Trump built or is building is fraught because some of it fell apart in 2020. And then that, Biden should have been able to hang on to this coalition, and now Trump has it in 2024. It's not, I agree with that the word coalition is important to think about how voters vote together. But what Brian Williams is saying is that this was like an active choice on the part of the Democratic Party to say like goodbye to certain voters when they have been moving in and out of the parties over time, and we're just in a moment where they're moving right now.
And we don't know whether they're going to stay there.
That's right.
We've talked about this. I really think one of the more definitive factors in this election was the anti-incumbent wave, 100%. Right? Which we've seen hit democracies all over the world. Doesn't matter if you're liberal or conservative, incumbent parties were voted out. In fact, Harris did better than most incumbent parties. Yeah. So there's an argument to be made to say that maybe the Democrats don't do a lot, right? And I think they still can get better, right? Sure. You should still think about targeting and being smart about all that and reaching out to Latino communities. There's a lot you can do, but you may just do nothing and find 4 years from now, 2 years or 4 years now, to be in a much better position. And some of those voters, as you suggested, who have drifted out, maybe drifting back, right? So I guess I'm wary of overreacting to this election.
Well, and for all the reasons you described, but also, because Bernie Sanders, he said almost exactly the same things that Brian Williams did, just days after the election. And we've heard a lot of this, the finger pointing and all of that. But none of the two of these white men are saying the important thing also, which is that this was a woman of color trying to do this thing and run in an environment that's not hospitable to people with her identities, nor to the person she was serving with in office. And so to your point of doing nothing, we're so quick, we as voters or as parties, gatekeepers and so forth, are so quick to like, okay, we got to fix it. We got to figure out what we need to do. I think you're so right that we just have to, all of us have to just like sit and just wait and see what happens.
In some ways, that's what the Republicans did, right? Yeah. So Donald Trump lost in 2020 by a significant margin, yes. And the Republicans said, "Let's try him again," right? And he won a large electoral college victory, right? Not the huge numbers in sort of the popular vote, but still got that victory. So, all right, well, we've got to take another break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about polling.
It's my favorite thing.
Yes, and how well the polls did this year in 2024.
They did.
So we'll come back and sort of break down some data and think about strategies then.
Driving it home with Patty Vasquez.
People get caught up in this argument about student loan forgiveness, and there are so many different examples of this, but if there's a better way to do it, and I get that you paid yours off and you played by the rules and it's not fair. There's so many things in life that are not fair. Why would you want the burden of this to continue to increase and negatively impact the future of young people?
Patty Vasquez, weeknights 5 to 7 on WCPT 820.
You're listening to WCPT 820 because facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. I'm William Muck, and I'm joined here by my colleague, Suzanne Chod, and we're going to talk about some polling. But before we do, let me just remind listeners that you can listen live on weekdays from 2 to 5 p.m. at 8:20 a.m. or on TuneIn from the heartlandsignal.com, or tell Alexa to play WCPT from TuneIn. Suzanne, there's lots of options.
Just use them all. Try them all, see what works.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so one of the more fascinating questions coming out of this election is how well the polls did. There was lots of conversation about how the polls were off in 2016 and 2020. As we look back at 2024, what do we know about the performance of these polls?
Well, they did great. Mm-hmm. And even though, and this is what's so frustrating for those of us that either study polling or teach about polling, is that there's so much distrust of them because people don't understand what polls do, and then most media outlets don't report on what polls do or teach us how to read the polls, right? So when Donald Trump wins all 7 states and wins the popular vote, everyone's like, oh my God, the polls are so off because that wasn't supposed to happen. But the polls told us that those were all likelihoods, right? She could have won all 7. He could have won all 7. She could have won the popular vote. He could have won the popular vote. And so what we know is because pollsters are starting to act more like political scientists and model like social scientists, that the polls were historically accurate this time. And so my hope is that makes us trust them more, but my fear is that it will not.
Right. I mean, because they talk about that, the margin, they called the margin of election within less than 3 points, 2.94. Some of them were even closer. And when you compare that to previous elections, 2020, 2016, going all the way back, the polls are getting better, more accurate. We can talk about in a second why. One of the things that they still underestimated is Donald Trump. Right. So this is an interesting question. Even though the polls are getting better in a variety of ways, they're still underestimating Donald Trump. What are we to think of that and the unique factor that is Donald Trump?
So what's interesting is that this is one time where I don't think it's him specific. And this is the only time I will probably ever say this, right? Because while I do think there's probably some shy Trump respondents in surveys still, I think there's less of them than there were in 2016. But the main thing is the method that we use to poll. It's harder to get to people who are more likely to vote for Trump, right? So in 2016, it was not literally going on the ground into rural communities and then not weighting the data by education later. Okay. In 2020, we couldn't really go anywhere because of COVID. And so it was how do we model knowing some of the things that are more or less likely to make people vote for Trump. We still didn't do it appropriately, right? And so it's moving away from random digit dialing, which is just like random numbers and you call people, and moving towards mixed method ways of polling people. And then when you can't get them, making sure on the back end when you have the data that you know where to put the emphasis so that you get a more accurate result.
So we're getting in the weeds here. This is really important. But this is really, really important as we think about it, because I think when most people think about polling, they think about you get on the phone and you call somebody,
Which
right?
we used to. That's what we used to do.
Right. And I think the data showed that they still do some of that, but that was some of the least accurate polling. If you call up, and for all sorts of reasons that we know, right? Nobody answers their phone anymore. anymore. Right. Nobody even has phones anymore, right? It's all cell phones. So those are problematic. What we're really thinking about is they talk about modeling, right? I mean, you and I were talking about this the other day, that if you're a good pollster, what you're doing is modeling what you think the electorate is going to look like.
That's right.
So demographics. Who do you the people that are going to show up to vote, what does that look like?
Who are they?
Yeah, you build that, and then you poll those groups.
That's right.
And so talk to me about why you do that.
Yeah. Oh, why do we do that? It's funny you said that. Yeah. I mean, this is what so just to take a quick step back. So I'm not a forecaster, but I read the forecasts and I, teach political science forecasting students. And so what forecasters do is they take the fundamental things that they think decide an election. Some of the things have to do, and some of them are polling, how people vote, but it's also sort of these exogenous factors that go on in the community and in the environment that, decide whether someone's likely to vote or what an outcome might look like. And then we run a statistical model and it spits out a likelihood, right? And so what pollsters are doing now is they're looking back on voting patterns across time and saying, here are the people who go out and vote. So rather than the poll being random and representative of the whole country, who's likely to vote? Yeah. And then what do we need to know about those people? We don't just need to know their level of education, which is increasingly more important. And we don't just need to know their partisanship, which is increasingly important. Mm-hmm. Then the one thing that now we know we need is to ask them for whom they voted the last time.
Yeah, I'm smiling.
Right?
Yes.
And this is what political scientists have started doing now, actually, in some of the models that they're doing in their polling and in their forecasting. But because we know that for the party you vote for once is most likely the party you vote for over and over. Yeah. But if this is Trump specific, can we then what do we know about people who voted for him 3 times or twice or once or whatever? We have to ask that question. And what the data suggests and what the polls show is that if you wait on education, if you ask them their party and you ask them for whom they voted before, you get a much better result of what the electorate's going to do.
And as we think moving forward, once Donald Trump is no longer part of our political system, I think the pollsters have to be thrilled about where they're at, right? Because Trump is he's still hard to capture. Yeah. And I know there a lot of pollsters have talked about how you connect with Trump voters. I'm trying to remember who it was, but somebody was talking about that they did polls in 2020 or 2016 where they would call somebody and the respondent would say, Trump, 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 and then hang up the vote.
They don't count that.
Right. So how do you count that, right? And so in the previous elections, they didn't, but now they said they're sending a signal, right? We should be counting that as a Trump voter. Now, it doesn't do us any good on any of the other questions that we want to answer, but it's a signal, right? And so you're trying to constantly get better. But Trump is just an enigma, right? He's hard to capture. His voters are there, but the pollsters are doing really well otherwise. Yeah. So as you think about moving to the next presidential election, which as long as the Constitution holds, should likely not include Donald Trump.
That's right.
You would think that the polls will even be better.
Yes.
And maybe not predictive, right? I mean,
they're not supposed to be predictive.
Explain why that's the case.
Yeah, no, to correct you. Yeah. So that's the thing is we think that a poll predicts that this is exactly what is going to happen. But what it does is it says we have some amount of confidence, depending on the margin of error, that the actual numeric value for this question is this percent. Yeah. And so it's one thing if we explain it that way to say, like, okay, well, if a poll says that they're statistically tied, that means that one could be up by a lot, the other one could be up by a lot, or they could literally be tied. But it doesn't really predict an outcome as much as it says, here is the probability of something that might happen, which is hard to explain to people because, and without doing that, they don't trust the polls. And they're like, well, you told me this was the answer and it wasn't the answer. And I'm like, no, we actually didn't tell you that was the answer. This is why margin of error
matters, right? It gives you a sense of things. And there were a lot of things that the polls got right. One of which was suggesting that young voters were maybe not as behind the Democratic Party as they have been in the past. The other that men of color may be drifting, especially Latino men, right? So we saw some of those things which actually did play out.
That's right. Yeah, we absolutely did. And the exit polls are really a really good way for us to see where did the electorate move in this election. Yeah. And yes, we can compare across exit polls to see like where that's moving. But as we talked about previously, every election is still just a snapshot. Yeah. And so we can't say with any sort of, we can't prognosticate to suggest that all the voters that moved in this election are going to stay where they are. Yeah. And so we can't get lazy in the polling, right, is sort of the point. Is even when Trump is no longer on the ballot, or at least Trump Sr. is no longer on the ballot, we've learned a lot from his presidency and the people who vote for him about how we poll the electorate better, because he sort of cracked open these divisions that already existed that we weren't accounting for. It's going to make us better in the long run for polling.
Absolutely, right, and much more sophisticated. Yeah. When you hear pollsters talk about what they're doing, I can hang with it for like 30 seconds, and then they get more into the weeds, and it's really complicated because it is this idea of modeling. They're social scientists, right? They're saying this is what the electorate looks like, and they're making, I wouldn't say guesses, they're making predictions based on what they see, and then you go out and poll those individuals based on that electorate. And again, you can still miss, right? So, I can't think of the pollsters in Iowa. Seltzer, right? I mean, so she's been seen as the gold standard, and she built a model this time that was wrong, right? Sometimes you make some assumptions and you build a model that doesn't work very well, and that's okay, right? But overall, like organizations like 538, which do a poll of polls, right? So you've got this whole big group of polling. The aggregate, that's right, that's the right word. When you do that, you get to some really accurate numbers, and they did well in 2024. They should be proud.
They should, even though everyone's going to yell at them and say that they got it wrong this time. And I think that's what's so frustrating is that as political scientists, we know this, right? Like we try to uncover patterns, and we say when conditions look like XYZ, this thing is likely to occur. But if conditions change, that thing may or may not still occur. Right. And so that's what polls do. It's a forecast. It's like the weather, and everybody hates the weather people when they get the forecast wrong. Yeah. It's the same thing for forecasting and polling. When they think we get it wrong, then they don't trust us.
Well, and it's infinitely hard because the American electorate is always shifting and changing, right? And so you're trying to pick up on those shifts and then predict those shifts and say, hey, here's what we're seeing, and this is what might play out in the election. But it's an incredibly difficult job. But boy, they're getting better at it, right? I mean, I was reading through this saying like, hey, good job, good on you.
Well, because if we can, this is what a good social scientist does. When we are confronted with new information, we pivot. That's what we should do, and that's what they did. And I think what I imagine is that for the polls that didn't shift this time, that they need to start doing that to keep up with the ones that are. And so my hope is by the time we get to the midterms and then we get to 2 years past that for the next presidential election, the polls will be even more accurate regardless of who the candidates are.
That's a good thing as we think about our ability to assess information.
That's exactly right.
All right, we got to go to a break in just a second, but when we come back, we're moving to our favorite part of the show, which is our turkeys of the year. And Suzanne and I each have 3 turkeys of the year, but we are also interested in your turkeys of the year. So if you want to text in who you think is your political turkey of the year, the number is 773-763-9278. Again, 773-763-9278. Text us in who you think the turkey of the year is, whether that's Donald Trump Jr. or Donald Trump or Elon. Like, there are a lot of candidates out there.
So many turkeys.
We've got some unconventional ones that I think people are going to like. But yes, please hop on your phone and text us in your turkey of the year. We'll be back in just a couple minutes.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito. Live, local, and progressive. Fill in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. I'm William Muck, and I'm joined by my colleague, Suzanne Chod, and we are at my favorite segment of the show today, which is our political turkeys of the year.
Gobble, gobble.
Gobble, gobble. And so we should maybe put a little bit of background on this. The idea is that we're going to find political actors who've engaged in conduct that we would say is turkey-like, right?
Turkey-like.
Yes, absolutely. So I will lead off with mine. So my first turkey of the year is State Superintendent Ryan Walters of Oklahoma. So Ryan Walters, he has bought 500 Donald Trump God Bless the USA Bibles and is putting them in Oklahoma classrooms. Now, the Donald Trump God Bless USA Bible is way more expensive than other Bibles, which you can get for basically nothing. He's never
from a hotel room.
Exactly. He's nevertheless spending on that. Now, the Trump Bible does include the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence, and the Pledge of Allegiance. But, Suzanne, I think those are also on the internet. So I don't know.
Sure.
You don't need those in the Bible. But the other thing that sort of pushed him over the top was that he wrote an email to the Oklahoma Public School superintendents requiring them to show students a video of him announcing the new Department of Religious Freedom and Patriotism, in which he said a prayer for Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So this was to be shown to the superintendents, to the students, to the parents, all of this. For me, this is ridiculous and therefore worthy of a Turkey of the Year. I mean, for a couple of reasons. One, like if you're a superintendent of schools, you need to be efficient with your dollars and spending extra money.
That's funny that that's where you started.
Well, that's the first thing, right? I mean, you don't need to spend extra money on Donald Trump, God Bless the USA Bibles, because it's a waste of funds. But it's also pandering to the president. What do you think of this idea of God Bless the USA Trump Bibles, you know, in Oklahoma schools?
Now, the only thing I would wonder is there a CD copy of the Lee Greenwood song, like in the sleeve of the Bible?
He probably comes along with each shipment. Like he's got the time now.
Yes. Yes. I mean, so there's so much, right? I mean, obviously, I think your point about the funds is well taken. It's also the fact that like this Bible is best because it also has the Constitution, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Bill of Rights, which suggests that this separation of church and state is not something that actually exists.
Right.
So we need to, these things need to be infused with one another.
That's why it's the religious freedom and patriotism, right?
Obviously.
Yeah.
But also that there's this sort of unabashed, like almost like a bragging that's happening that like my candidate won, and so we're going to buy these Bibles and I'm going to tell you about how great he is and we're going to pray for him every day and I'm going to shove this in your faces, and I'm allowed.
Yeah. Encouraged, right?
Yes.
No, I mean, you're right. The bigger problem isn't the cost, it's the separation of church and state.
No, I think, because it's expensive.
It is, but this idea of infusing religion and politics together, right, and reinterpreting the Constitution to say the founders actually wanted that, right? That's sort of the core of a lot of the Christian nationalist movements are to say that the founders didn't intend the separation of church and state. In fact, they intended this to be a Christian nation, which, again, I think is an inaccurate reading of the Constitution. But we sort of see this infused, and so that's troubling. But then this sort of, the buying and the sending of the videos and praying for Donald Trump, all of that feels like, you're going to be nominated for Turkey of the Year.
I think he deserves it. And he make it a cabinet post, in fact. So, Turkeys of the Year and cabinet posts, perhaps they should be in the same, not a literal one. You looked at me like I knew something
now that when you mentioned that, I thought he's climbing ladders, right?
If they had not already announced somebody for the Department of Education, perhaps he would have been the choice.
Yes.
Turkeys at the top.
Wow. All right. Why don't we go with your first Turkey of the Year?
So mine is a bit unconventional in that a lot of people may not know who he is.
Yeah.
But every morning I would come in and I would say to Bill how frustrated I was by this particular person.
Yes.
So my first Turkey of the Year is Harry Enton.
Yes. You're going to tell people who that is.
No. So he's a senior data reporter for CNN. He wrote for 538, and to be fair, he is well educated, went to Dartmouth. He knows a lot about data, and so I love a data person.
Yeah.
But they used him a lot, CNN did, in this election cycle to explain what the polls meant. So he would come on and he would talk about the polls, and he never talked about them accurately. He would talk about pre-election polls versus exit polls.
Yeah.
He would say, here's what the pre-election polls say for 2024 and compare them to exit polls from 2020, which are not the same thing. He never gave the appropriate context to like what the polls were actually saying. He was extrapolating causality without having any information about why.
Yeah.
And the one that put me over the edge, and listen, I'm not necessarily a Swiftie, it just happens to be about Taylor Swift, this one, is that he took a poll from 2017 and compared it to a poll now, and it showed that Taylor Swift's popularity had decreased, and he said that was because Donald Trump didn't like her. And so gobble gobble for Harry Enton.
Right. I'm guessing that's not statistically significant. So,
no causality there. So he's one of my Turkeys of the Year.
Fantastic. I would see you come in and just be livid at something because the political data and the interpretation of that data matters, right? And CNN, MSNBC, a lot of the networks have good people doing this. And I remember one time he was comparing across racial groups, or he was talking about, I think, black men and using one survey and then using something else. And like, he can't do that.
Can't do that. I understand, this is like Kaki Kornacki, right?
Yeah.
He comes on and he does a great job. But he stays in his lane. He's like, I'm just going to tell you what the data are.
Sure.
But I'm not going to tell you what they mean.
Yeah.
Because maybe he doesn't know what they mean.
Sure.
And I don't think Harry Enton knows what they mean. And so I'm also not suggesting causation here that maybe CNN viewers were more surprised by Harris's loss or less surprised by Harris's loss because of his lack of appropriate interpretation. But a senior data reporter should know how to report on data.
Should be better, or otherwise you're going to end up on Dr. Chod's Turkey of the Year list.
Turkey gobble, gobble, gobble.
All right, let's go to the text lines. We're getting some good people texting in. All right, Joe Biden as Turkey of the Year. He never should have run. It should have thought else. Should have done something. What do you think about Joe Biden as Turkey of the Year?
I can see people's frustration in hindsight saying he should have never run and maybe we wouldn't have had Trump again. And so I can see frustration. I don't consider him a turkey personally because I think he's an incredibly honorable, selfless public servant.
Okay. I tend to agree, right? Yeah. I go back and forth. I think that history is going to remember Joe Biden better than the current moment. Now, I do think not having Harris win complicates Joe Biden's legacy. Yes. I mean, if she had become president, that really elevates Joe Biden in terms of his historical role. But I think he is somebody who believed in good governance, who didn't want to be flashy, just wanted to do the right thing. And I think ultimately, he may not be top 10 president, but certainly I think they'll remember him. But I still respect somebody saying he's Turkey of the Year.
I agree. Same.
All right. So we have a vote for Nick Fuentes for his comment, "Your body, my choice," saying that it's not only disgusting and misogynist, it's dangerous. True. That's a good comment.
It's not a good comment.
I mean, it's a good Turkey of the Year. Yes,
and he could be a Turkey of the Year for so many reasons. Yeah. That just happens to be the one that, and I totally agree with, is that and what he got started. Which actually leads to he's sort of in one of my other turkeys as well. Sure, so my categories. So
I'll go a couple more.
No, I'm just saying.
So if our listeners want to keep texting in 773-763-9278, your Turkey of the Year. Another one, Matt Gaetz.
Oh yeah.
I'm not going to read the second part of the text because it's not so appropriate, but nevertheless, Matt Gaetz is seen as one. Let's see. Who else? We have Joe Biden. Somebody else saying that. They say, how is Joe Biden selfless? His selfishness is what cost us the election. So again, it seems like Joe Biden is, the listeners are thinking that maybe he should be Turkey of the Year. Yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah. All right. Who do you got for your second turkey?
So speaking of Nick Fuentes, my second turkey is bro culture.
Okay.
And bro culture could be a turkey every year, but how do you want to say resurgence of it? The celebration of it and the unabashed nature of it. And to the point of Nick Fuentes and some of the things that we've seen after the election, the rubbing in the face of people who are victims of bro culture. Not loving the bro culture right now.
No, a great Turkey of the Year nomination. And I'm thinking about Pete Hegseth, right? Yeah. Is a great example of that. Mm-hmm. Somebody who's getting ahead by embracing that. Mm-hmm. One of the callers was talking about Tom Nichols, right? Yeah. I think it was Steve was talking about Tom Nichols, and so he's a professor emeritus at the Army, or I think Naval War College. Yeah, he's one of the schools, and he was talking about how dangerous this is. Somebody who's trained cadets and talked about this and said that this bro culture is actually really, really dangerous, and it's the last thing that you want somebody leading the DOD with, right? And we're seeing this permeate across all of Trump's picks, but it was also very central in terms of deciding the election.
It was, and I'll be not in a good way, sort of curious on our own campus to see how this manifests, if at all, in the way that certain students who want to take political science classes, or how we talk about the Trump presidency and things like that. If there's sort of a swagger for those who feel vindicated by a culture that's now being embraced more widely. And as a woman, I don't particularly love how that feels.
No, that's right. We talked about this earlier about the ebb and flow, and what we are seeing is a backlash. Yeah. We are seeing this pushback against the advancements of women's rights, and again, Donald Trump is the perfect vessel for that.
That's right.
Well, maybe this is a good transition to my second Turkey of the Year, which is the American public.
We suck.
Right, and for a whole bunch of reasons. I was reading some data the other day, and a lot of people are talking about the economy, and that the economy was central in deciding the election. There's no question, right? The perceptions of the economy were central to many people who decided to vote for Donald Trump. This was, and those are real things, right? You think about individuals who are struggling to get by. I don't think, that's always an accurate interpretation. And so some of the data that I was looking at was asking people how they perceived their own financial situation versus the economy as a whole. And it was stunning that when you ask most Americans about their own individual financial situation, most of them said they feel really positive about it. I mean, it was something like 65 or 75% felt positive about their own financial position. But then when you asked them about the economy as a whole, it was much lower. Only 20% or so thought that the economy as a whole was strong. So there's this disconnect between a huge chunk of Americans who think they are doing well and in a good position, but yet nevertheless think that the economy is not doing well, right? And we should be able to connect the dots a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, so I think as you were talking, I kept thinking, like, it's about, so we talk about power is relational and social positioning, right?
Yeah.
And so if I feel like I'm doing well, but I'm worried that I'm not going to be doing well because other people might be doing better, and then the entire economy is dragged down because we're giving things to people who are then going to start taking, and my social position is threatened. It's white grievance. Yeah. It's racialized economic anxiety. Yeah. I think that disconnect is really well described by, we want to keep the position we're in, and we're afraid that others are our economy is going to give them more, and it's going to give us less.
Yeah, again, it speaks to the things we've talked about in terms of civic education, having an electorate that's more aware of what's going on. And, talking to others who live around the world, we have a lot of international students, and I'm connected with some people in different countries, international politics, and the sense of frustration with America. Yes. You could talk about 2016. Donald Trump sort of snuck up on people. Yeah. It was the year of Brexit. Like, Brexit surprised the United Kingdom. Donald Trump surprised us. Yeah. This time around, we knew everything. We did. We knew everything about Donald Trump, all of his flaws, and he did not hide any of those things.
He leaned in more.
Yes, that's right. He leaned into Trump, and the American public still said, we want that guy rather decisively, right? I mean, it was still a close election, but there was an appeal to him, and I think the American public and bro culture go together right now in a way that's not particularly good for the long-term democracy.
No, and students have, one of the things that they expressed to me right after the election, their frustration, sort of, especially those who have minoritized identities, is like, 70 million people decided that my existence didn't matter to them because they wanted more money in their pockets. Yeah. And they had a real hard time with that, which I completely understand. And so I think, not that this made them feel any better, but one of the things I said is, of those 70-some million people, I don't know how many of them really, truly buy into and believe every single thing that Donald Trump stands for, including bro culture. But they said, I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I will tolerate that.
I will tolerate it because I'm probably going to be fine.
Yes.
Not thinking about who else may not be fine.
Right.
That is a really hard thing to come to terms with when we look at the American public's choices.
Yep. Yes. And then when you sprinkle on a little dis and misinformation,
and a lot of authoritarianism.
Right, exactly. Right. I mean, this is the thing, because to Barbara McQuade's point, we have to fight back against some of these forces, right? To say, and not like Republican, Democrat, fight for democracy, right? I think that's the really important point here. And it becomes more difficult to do so when you have a populace that's not really engaged, is not interested in learning. I mean, that's one of the things that we saw, the diploma divide, right? It's quite dramatic, where Democrats are trending much more education, and Trump voters and much less education. That's a really, that makes the challenge much more difficult to have a real and meaningful debate about what democracy should be addressing.
And the education divide has always been important, but what we're seeing now is that it's an engagement divide. Yeah. And so it's not just that Democrats have a higher level of education, Republicans are under or uneducated. Yeah. But if you look at, from this election in particular, and you probably saw these data, right?
It's so powerful.
The more engaged you are, the more you watch the news, the way more likely you were to vote for Harris. And the reverse, if you were unengaged and not watching the news because you're getting snippets, or you're on your you're in your circles, or you're just talking to people. And so it's not just education, it's also level of engagement.
Yes.
That's like the next frontier now of trying to overcome some of these things, is level of engagement.
This is right. And Donald Trump was able to motivate 100%. And mobilize those voters, right? And in a way that it was difficult for Democrats to reach out to them. So, all right, well, we need to go to a break, and then we'll come back and do our final turkeys of the year. Keep those texts coming in. 773-763-9278 for your turkeys of the year. We'll be back in just a couple minutes.
Alexa, play WCPT.
WCPT from TuneIn.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. My name is William Muck, and I'm again joined by Dr. Suzanne Chod, and we're talking through our turkeys of the year. And Suzanne, the text line is blowing up, so we've got some other ones. Benjamin Netanyahu has Turkey of the Year. Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's maybe least of things we could call him as a turkey, perhaps.
Yes. No, that's right. There's other things we could talk about, but especially the way that I think he has played the Biden administration, where the Biden administration was trying to have meaningful conversation about. I don't think Netanyahu always participated in an even-handed way on that. So,
and I think it made Biden sometimes look like a turkey, like he's not doing enough because Netanyahu is just not interested at all in anything the U.S. has to say.
That's a good way of putting it. So, okay, turkeys. Another texter says Jill Stein, RFK Jr. Neither of which are on my ballot. Let's see. Matt Gaetz is getting a lot of votes. People don't like Matt Gaetz. Let's see who else. This is an interesting one. Turkeys, the Democrats who stayed home and didn't vote. That's an interesting one.
It's not me.
No.
Don't blame me.
No. But that is a good one,
absolutely.
Right? Absolutely great turkeys. Another Jill Stein. This texter says Turkey of the Year, Jill Stein, or is it the Democrats that were fooled by her and gave her their vote?
It's so interesting to see where she may have made a difference.
Yeah.
We always talk about third-party candidates, and you should always vote for whom you feel is the closest and represents you the best. And so this particular texter seems to think that Jill Stein, and I don't know whether this is true, like duped people into being like, vote for me because I have your interests.
Yes.
And then did that make a difference in a state? And we have President Trump again.
Right. And this is an interesting question. I haven't seen data on whether Jill Stein got enough votes to matter, right? Yeah. Sometimes there were third-party candidates where they mattered. I think I'd have to dive more into the data to see. Yeah. It's still, certainly for Democratic causes, Jill Stein was not necessarily positive, whether she was decisive or not. I will say there were a lot of our students who were engaged by Jill Stein, right? And there was a frustration with the Democratic Party.
Yeah, okay.
And certainly when you've got a tight election, something like that can matter. And it's a good vote for Turkey of the Year.
I like it.
Yes.
I'm here for it.
All right. What do you got for your next, Suzanne, your next Turkey of the Year?
So my next Turkey of the Year, and Bill, when you started, you were like, sort of political actors. And so I don't know, this is not a political actor insofar as it's it's its own phenomenon, and it's not original, but AI.
Yep.
For all of the reasons.
Well, make the case.
Make the case. Okay, so we can make the case for reasons, the way that affects campaigns with deep fakes and the way disinformation is exponentially more challenging now because of AI and because of a lack of enforcement on platforms like X.
Yep.
Right? So all of that. But personally, and you hear me rail about this, and we do it together all the time on campus, is that it's making my job a lot harder. Right?
Yep.
I mean, ChatGPT and other bots that are writing students' essays and exam questions for them, it's making my job harder and less enjoyable.
I don't know if our listeners who are not teachers know how widespread this is and how good ChatGPT and the other ones have gotten at producing essays. I oftentimes throw the questions I ask on exams into ChatGPT.
And they're brilliant answers.
Yeah, sometimes brilliant. Sometimes they're like B answers, and you're like, and it's hard to know. You can't check them. The software, the AI checking software is not super robust. It makes our job infinitely difficult.
And less joyful.
Yeah, no, although, again, there's good and bad to AI, but we see a lot of the bad.
There is. And I think part of the responsibility that we have as a culture is to, and this is to what Barbara McQuade was saying about information literacy and media literacy, she said. This is part of it, right? If we're going to embrace AI, then we have to figure out how to do it responsibly, and I don't know what that looks like.
You don't trust Elon to do that responsibly? Now, actually, Elon is too easy of an answer for Turkey of the Year, right? I mean, that's because we said, you can't, Trump's probably too easy. Elon's too easy.
For sure.
Joe Rogan's maybe an interesting one for Turkey of the Year.
I think so, too.
We have another texter coming in saying that Merrick Garland nominating for Turkey of the Year. And again, this is something we're seeing in the Democratic Party. There's a lot of frustration with Merrick Garland and the pace at which he moved forward. And, Barbara McQuade made the argument that, hey, I think he's doing the things the way that we want an attorney general to do so. But there's a lot of frustration among liberals saying, but he should have done it quicker.
Yeah, because maybe Trump would have been indicted and already convicted and already sentenced before he could run again.
All right, I've got another one from a texter that I think you're going to have some comments on. Nancy Mace. Yeah. Who, which we maybe offer a little bit of background.
Yes.
She is a member of the House.
From South Carolina.
Yes. Who is advocating for a bill to deny transgendered individuals access to the bathroom.
With their gender. Yes. So she, yes, that's the best way to describe it. So Sarah McBride was elected from Delaware. She's the first transgender person elected to the federal Congress. So she's going to start serving in the House in January. And after her election, Nancy Mace introduced a resolution saying that you have to go to the bathroom based on your biological sex. Now, Marjorie Taylor Greene said that Sarah McBride should not be able to use any bathroom in the Capitol. So she upped it with just language as opposed to introducing a resolution. And the Speaker of the House has now said that, yes, you have to use the bathroom of your biological sex.
I think that's grounds for Turkey of the Year, right?
She's more than a turkey.
I mean, this is something as you and I were driving in today, we were talking about. Like, when we see the backlash, it's always targeting access to bathrooms.
Always.
Right? I mean, we think back through all the, gay, color, people of color, right? This is a common theme we see over and over and over again, denying people access to bathrooms. And I would have thought
that's when you're in your most private, intimate, vulnerable space, and it's also with the gay community. It's also about sort of the pedophile stereotype, right?
Yes,
which is also really dangerous.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
You're right. It's access to bathrooms is always where we see this fight, and and I was talking about this with students the other day. Is that we cannot underscore how this feels for Sarah McBride. Her entire life has been just fighting to be seen as a person, and so this is not new to her, and she's taken the high road in ways I don't know that I ever could.
Sure.
But I also think about so she's now going to have to go into a men's bathroom.
Yeah.
Do men at the urinal want a woman to come into their bathroom?
I don't know if they've thought.
I don't go to those bathrooms.
I don't think Nancy Mace has thought through all of the implications of this. But you're right that she has handled this with such grace. And to say, I'm not going to make this an issue. I'm just here
to serve
and to solve problems. Right? Yeah. All right. I will get to my final Turkey of the Year. Nikki Haley. And this one was my son Fisher. We were talking about this. He's like, it's got to be Nikki Haley. And he convinced me. I'm like, absolutely. And the case for Nikki Haley is that she ran for president and during that campaign was extremely critical of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but saying both of them were too old. Both of them should not serve. And when the campaign moved on, she was one of the remaining candidates and became quite critical of Donald Trump in very meaningful ways. Then ended her campaign. And there were all these questions. Is she going to embrace Trump? And I knew from the first minute that she would, right? She would endorse Trump. She would get behind him, which she then did, hoping probably for some sort of cabinet position.
I'm sure.
And then Donald Trump, in a public way, said no to you, right? You are not going to have any position in the administration.
That's right.
And now Nikki Haley has gone back to being critical of Donald Trump and some of his appointees. And, so the hypocrisy is so difficult to sort of wrap my head around.
Right,
because
now.
Nikki Haley, we talk about, individuals, populists who have an education. She's highly educated. She is smart. She understands the world and politics, and she knows exactly what Donald Trump is. She knows that he's a populist authoritarian who threatens the democracy because she has said as much.
All of that.
And I think that's the hard part. I get people who aren't engaged, haven't read about democracy, right? I sort of understand that position and why Trump could be appealing. She knows better.
That's why, I hate Chris Sununu. He's my turkey, one of my turkeys also for the same reason, because these people know better.
Yeah.
And it's so power grabby, what Nikki Haley is doing. And this is what I sort of joked about when Tulsi Gabbard was helping Trump with debate prep. I was like, she's trying to stay relevant. And look at her now in a position in the cabinet. Nikki Haley, same thing, trying to stay relevant. And when she got the big thumbs down, was like, well, I guess I'll just go back to actually telling people what I think of him. But now we don't know what to believe.
Right. It's putting personal ambition, putting politics, putting power above the democracy. And I get this happens all of the time. But with somebody like Donald Trump, where the threat is so grave and so severe. And so,
as she has said.
Yes, exactly. And so obvious to not do that, to sort of go back and forth on that strikes me as you're going on my Turkey of the Year list.
This is where Adam Kinzinger avoids the Turkey of the Year.
Yes.
Because he has stayed unequivocally in his corner.
But that's a rare corner, right?
That's right.
And so I think Haley is representative of Republicans in general who've been unwilling to stand up to Donald Trump. So, well, we need to wrap up. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for joining me today. Again, Dr. Suzanne Chod from North Central College. Thank you to Joan Esposito for giving me the space here today. Thank you for Paul for making all the things work so fantastic. And I will be back on Friday. And happy Thanksgiving to everybody.